So Carrie, I see that Councilor Wu has joined us. So we have all the lead sponsors here. What I'm thinking is I know that Chief Roberts does have it, and I think Ms. Hogan both have time restraints. I think they're with us for about an hour. So we'll do their panel first, do our questions, and then move on to the rest of the panels following that.
Sounds good to me. I am ready to roll when you are.
All right, Councilor Royo, that sound fine? I see your reaction. Councilor Wu, Councilor Mejia?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. And then we'll go to the rest. Hello, Ms. Starrett, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Hello. All right, Carrie, if you are ready, I'm ready. Carrie, we good to go?
Yep, all set, ready to go.
All right, thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Anise Sabi-George, and I'm chair of the Boston City Council's Committee on Education. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 executive order modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that the public bodies conduct its meeting in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health recommendations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate alternative means. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed on boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcast at a later date on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964. It's also available on YouTube. Today's hearing is on docket 0886, order for a hearing regarding the selection of NWEA as the admissions exam vendor for Boston's exam schools and the impact exam-based admissions has on diverse enrollment in those schools. This matter is sponsored by Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, Councilor Michelle Wu, and Councilor Julia Mejia, and was referred to the Committee on Education on July 20th, 2020. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing. If you wish to testify via video conference, please email juan.lopez@boston.gov to sign up. When you are called, please state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes to ensure that all comments can be heard. You may also submit written testimony by emailing ccc.education@boston.gov. This afternoon, I'm happy to be joined by a number of colleagues, including the lead sponsors, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor Wu, Councilor Mejia, as well as Councilor Braden and Councilor O'Malley. And I haven't been joined by others in the meantime, just looking at my notes. I will briefly introduce all of the panelists that we'll have in this first panel, and we do have a number of panels this afternoon, and then turn this over to the lead sponsors and colleagues for opening statements. This first panel, we will be joined by Monica Roberts, Chief of Student, Family, Community Advancement and in the Boston Public Schools, as well as Ms. Rachel Starrett, Head of School at Boston Latin School. We have 3 panels following that. I will introduce them when we pull them on screen. We do want to get Chief Roberts and Ms. Starrett on because there's some time restraints. I would like to thank all of the panelists for being here today and continuing this conversation on exam schools. This hearing order was filed this summer when NWEA was chosen as the exam school vendor for a possible test this fall. Last night, in a marathon meeting of the school committee with over 180 members of the public testifying, the school committee voted not to have an exam school admissions test for the school year 21-22. This hearing is intended to focus on the next steps for an exam school admissions process with an eye on how we improve equity in our schools. I request that anyone wishing to comment on the school committee's inadequate process and monumental decision to please send your comments directly to them. You're also welcome to send them to me. Today, we will explore how Boston Public Schools chooses exam vendors, what the tests might look like in the future, what the current reality of being an exam school student is like, and the implications of the exam school test on our school district as a whole. With that, I'd also like to note there was some conversation prior to today's hearing, why this hearing was held after last night's school committee meeting. There were a number of scheduling conflicts that didn't allow us to hold it before last night, but also want to note that this is about the selection of the exam school process, the exam schools themselves, and what will happen in the future. With that, I'd like to give the original co-sponsors a moment to offer opening remarks and statements, and then allow the rest of our colleagues to give some opening comments before moving to our first panel. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll dive right into it because we have a few panels. I was born and raised here in the city of Boston. I went to public schools and I got to see and experience firsthand the way that we as a school system funnel children into this sort of zero-sum game of believing, children and families, that there's basically one golden ticket in town on the way out to opportunity, and that is our selective admission schools. And I remember I was at the Timothy, the pressure that those children felt, understanding that it was basically 3 schools, and for some of them really just 1 school or bust. And the idea that if I didn't get into these specific schools, then the rest of my life is essentially being decided for me now. And for a 6th grader or a 7th or 8th grader to feel that kind of pressure is already just innately wrong. That's a failure on our part to create a structure where children feel like there's only specific places in which they can succeed. And so directly to how we create these specific spaces. And, I've had these conversations internally with myself, because I'm not new to these discussions. My father was on the school committee in the 90s, and this was an issue, how we get into the exam schools. And the reality is it's very difficult for me to talk about inequitable processes and inequitable resources while talking about how to make an inequitable process more or less inequitable. And the reality is having a 2-tier system of education in which we have exam schools or selective admission schools separate and apart from all of the rest of our schools is an inequity. And at some point in the future, maybe we should have a discussion about whether or not the actual act of selective admission schools is by and in itself opportunity hoarding and inequity in and of itself. But today we're here to talk about the process for getting into these schools. And for me, the one thing that I think has been clear by everybody that has spoken on this, whether in support of standardized examinations or opposed to standardized examinations, is the reality that they serve to perpetuate institutional racism. That's what they do. That's what they were created to do originally by eugenics. And so when we talk about that, I don't believe, and I'm happy for anybody who's attending today and speaking today to correct this, I don't believe there's a single standardized exam in this country that people of color or those who are lower on the socioeconomic scale outperform white test takers and those with more resources. And the reason for that is that exams don't do a good job or are perfect or great at figuring out your intelligence level or your ability to handle rigor or any of those things, or your potential as a learner. What they do a really good job of is identifying the advantages that you have had in your life, and whether or not you are one of those folks who have had the advantages of having extra tutoring, of having resources available to you. And we have to grapple with the reality that those advantages in this country have been bestowed upon some because of race and because of a legacy and a history of exclusion of people of color from rooms and from policy and from opportunity. And that this serves, and standardized examinations serve to continue that process. And so for me, this is separate and apart from what was decided yesterday. I don't believe standardized exams should be part of our entrance exam to selective admission schools. I think we have to come up with a plan that doesn't include that. That's where I'm coming from. And I hope I was clear on why. And so for me, I'm calling for this hearing. I was calling for it because I think we have to really grapple and do battle with the way that standardized examinations are a tool of white supremacy, are a tool of institutional racism, and how that tool is being used to ensure that these inequities that we see in who gets to attend BPS is higher echelon schools of BLS, BLA, and O'Brien play out. And so that's why I'm here today. And I hope to go over those things with you today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia, and then Councilor Wu.
Sure. Thank you, Chairwoman Asabi George, and to my lead sponsors and my co-sponsors for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Councilor Arroyo and Wu, this hearing is going to be a little bit challenging for me because I need to learn how to balance between my position as a city councilor and my feelings of frustration as an Afro-Latina who grew up in this city during the busing era. And I know that people are probably wondering why I keep invoking the busing era as it relates to this exam test, but I see the correlation between these two worlds because it always feels like the haves and the have-nots. And where you live and what type of access to resources you have will dictate the type of outcomes you will have, your educational and your pathways out of poverty. I'm going to try to really be balanced. I know that back then in the 70s, we were still feeling the same frustrations that we're feeling right now. I feel like we're in a tale of two different cities and two different systems, one for the privileged and one for everybody else. And I was one of those kids that got everybody else. I didn't even know exam schools existed, to be 100%, until after I was working in the education space. I was that kid that I was on the do not drop out track because I had already stopped going to school and I went back. So no one would ever talk to me about anything that dealt with my own future. And I think that those feelings of level of frustration when you have these elite schools and all of this pressure as to who gets in and who doesn't really doesn't help solve the issues that we have been struggling with here in the city of Boston for centuries, it feels like. I see it as our jobs to try to channel that frustration into a dialogue and that dialogue into action. I'm not here to attack or blame anyone or blame anyone or any school for that matter. This is a systemic issue that we all have to play a role in dismantling. And I hope that in this hearing, we'll be able to get to the work to find new and innovative ways of making these exam schools more equitable. And let's work together on how we can come about that change. And there's one thing that, I still have yet to Google it, but I know that my colleague, Councilor Matt O'Malley, always talks about called metaratus. It's a word that I can't even pronounce, but it's something that deals with like merit, meritocratus. I don't know what it is.
Meritocracy, girl.
Meritocracy.
That's right.
Meritocracy. And when I think about that, I think about, first of all, I didn't even know what the word meant, right? But I know that it has something to do with merit. And I know that my merit and the things that I've been through, I'm just as smart or as deserving as anyone else. And just because I happen to live in Dorchester or in neighborhoods where schools have far gone neglected, I don't think that because I may not be able to be smart enough to test into some of these schools does not mean that I don't have the capacity to thrive and also to be just as competitive. So my daughter right now is 10 years old, right? I whether she gets into an exam school or not, it's not my goal. I don't know why everybody thinks that that's the winning ticket out of poverty and like everybody got to get into these exam schools. I personally do not believe that they are the end all and be all. Right? I'm gonna be 100% about that. But what I do find to be startling is that the way our kids get the way our kids get decided as to who is able to be prepared, who has the time, the energy, the access to disposable income. When we know that the net worth of a Black family is $8, and you compare that to a white family of $240,000, who has the disposable income to spend thousands of dollars on private tutors? So if we're not talking about this in terms of equity, and if we're not talking about who has the right to the privilege of being able to access these schools, then we need to shut down the whole entire way that we go about doing this. And I think that the admission should not be based on merit in terms of like the smart kids, because I think that says a lot to people, right? Anyways, I'm babbling at this point. I'm going to spare you babble, but I just want to know that I am not in support of anything that's going to prevent my people and my kids from being able to thrive, just like everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Mejia. Counselor Wu, and then we'll go to Counselor Breeden and Counselor O'Malley and Counselor Campbell. Counselor Wu?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to the co-sponsors on this. As was mentioned, this was filed long ago because it was meant to be about the big picture, long-term conversation, including what is happening, what was voted on last night, but moving forward into the structure of our school district as a whole. I'm a BPS mom. My son is in K2 now, and it's actually my second round 2 of being a BPS mom, because I raised my younger sister who went to Boston Latin School and graduated in, well, anyway, I won't get into how old she is. The experience of being on both ends of this now, and the younger end of the spectrum, the older end of the spectrum, really has shown just how deep the inequities run in our district and how much of a Hunger Games model we are putting on our parents, families, students, caregivers today. And so this is a really important conversation to have about which schools we are holding up in what ways, with what gates in front of them, what resources are behind those gates, but also how everything has to fit together across the entire district for every student in all of those beautiful K2 classrooms, right? The spaces that my sister was in, the classrooms and her peers, and how much that reflected the city looked very different from the spaces and the classrooms that I've seen in our kindergarten and elementary school classrooms. And so something happens along the way, right? I think Councilor Arroyo has spoken to give in voice to what types of barriers and structures have been funneling and shaping and holding back students of color and Black and Latinx families in particular. So I'm interested in continuing this conversation about where we move with this year as a turning point. There are still many questions about this year in particular. I remain very concerned that the families most impacted by this decision, many of them still do not understand what is happening. I can't even answer every question on how exactly the decisions will be made in terms of lotteries and ties between GPAs and this and that and what happens and et cetera. So I hope to get into some of those questions today as well, to ensure that we are using this year and this opportunity of a transformation to build trust in moving towards larger changes, rather than as just a temporary Band-Aid that will get ripped off in a very painful way once again when we are past this. So I want to thank everyone for being here, especially our school representatives and BPS administrators, who I'm sure had a very long night as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Wu. Counselor Breeden?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to keep my comments very brief. I know we want to hear from the panelists. I feel strongly that these high stakes tests, admission tests for our exam schools, put an incredible amount of stress on families and students. And it also creates this this divide. Like, so many families feel that if their child does not get into one of the exam schools, like it's the end of the world. And that's a really sad situation. We have so many high schools in Boston. I want to get to a place where it doesn't feel like the end of the world anymore, and that we have top-notch, world-class high schools across our school district that will help meet the needs of all of our students to develop their full human potential. Not everyone is cut out to go to an exam school. It's really important that we have a world, like a top-notch vocational technical high school. It's really important that there's high schools that meet the needs of all of our students, not just the select few that are lucky enough to go to Latin school or the O'Brien, etc. So it's high stakes testing at a young age, and I really feel that we should not be labeling children failures at that young age. We should be seeing their full human potential and working constantly to get develop all that potential right until the day that they graduate from high school in Boston. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Braden. Councilor O'Malley and then Councilor Campbell. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my colleagues for calling this important and timely conversation. Thank you to the panelists. I'm looking forward to delving more into some specifics and, of course, most importantly, hearing from parents and other stakeholders involved. You know, I appreciate the passion and the thoughtfulness that the prior speakers have already sort of set the tone for the important issues that we're grappling with. These are issues that I have a perspective as a BPS product, as an alumnus of an exam school, Boston Latin School, as a city official, and as a new parent, admittedly far off from the BPS process, but still, that's obviously colors my view on this as well. And I just wanted, well, I appreciate what was said and agree with a lot of what was said. As we get into some specifics on this hearing today, as it relates to an assessment, the new assessment, the NWEA test, I, for one, am glad that we are using this test, which will be a marked improvement over the prior examination in many regards. It's universally regarded as such. Even many educational advocates who've been critical of this process have cited the NWEA test as an examination or an assessment that is a much better resource that will get and produce much better outcomes. And I say that to say that obviously it won't be used this year. There is a commitment that it will be used next year, and that is a commitment that I agree with and support using assessment, support using an examination. But I want to be clear that this ought not be a debate whether we have a test or whether we have greater diversity in our schools, particularly our exam schools. These two conflicts, these two ideas are not in conflict with one another. We can do both, and by God, we must do both. And I'm not just talking about access. I'm just not talking about increasing help or tutoring or the exam school initiative, all these things that we've done. There are other things that we can do. One thing that I pushed for successfully, we were only able to do it 1 year. Last year was offering the examination in every Boston public school. That's a good step. Another thing that we need to clearly do is have a unified rubric as it relates to private schools, parochial schools, Catholic schools, and public schools to make sure that the grades are on the same plane. But even more than that, there are other ways that we can both protect a meritocracy and make sure that there is access to that meritocracy across the board, and have exam schools that better reflect our student population. This isn't a new idea. This is something that the schools have been grappling with. When I was a student at Boston Latin School, there were policies in place that guaranteed both the academic rigor as well as concrete policies that allowed for a student body that better reflected the city at large. That policy was challenged in court, but I cite it to suggest that there are things that we are doing and can be doing. So I'm looking forward to this hearing, to continuing the conversation. I want to be clear, having and I do not think any of my colleagues would disagree with this for one iota, but I'm just saying it because through the course of this debate, through the course of the last week or so, sometimes I think nuance gets lost. And I just want to be clear that having the academic rigor, having an assessment like an examination is not in conflict with doing more and putting some substantial and significant policies in place that will make sure that our schools better reflect the city. And I, for one, and I know all of you are committed to doing just that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. And as colleagues continue to join this afternoon's hearing, I let everyone sort of have as much time as they needed for opening statements because there was just a few of us, and as folks have added on, I do want to note that our first panel does have a time limit of 5. So if colleagues could be more brief, that would be helpful. We have Councilor Campbell and then Council President Janey. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, thank you to the panelists and the makers. As everyone knows, this issue is deeply personal to me as a BPS graduate of 5 Boston public schools, including Boston Latin School. And I'm a proud Boston Latin School graduate. And I'm very happy to see Miss Starrett, who is on here, along with Monica, of course. And I know what these schools mean to our community. I know what they mean to a student, a family. I also know what it means to families who do not have access to these schools. And for me, it's personal. It's not just talking about the data that tells us that the system, BPS system, is inequitable and that there are inequities with respect to access to not only exam schools, but to high quality schools in the district. This is also personal for me. I often talk about this reason I do this work is because of the loss of my twin brother. And I know there are many systems that failed him, but one is plainly clear. It's BPS failed him. He didn't go to a Boston Latin school. He went to Madison Park, which was struggling to get resources at the time. He went to Burke High School, which wasn't even accredited at the time. And not to suggest those teachers and principals weren't working hard. They were. They did not have the same resources and opportunities there as they did in other schools. This conversation for me about who has access, the exam, what type of exam, it is absolutely entangled with inequities, with race and racism, and with, as Councilor Mejia said, busing. She's like, I keep bringing it up because it's all connected. Who has access, how they have access, of course, is deeply connected to that painful history that we often don't want to talk about. But if we are going to make this school system truly equitable for every single person, and this system doesn't just fail people of color, it fails all of us. And we all have a role to improving it. But if we want to do that, we have to be honest. And I will tell you, if you did not read Dr. Kindy's remarks at the school committee hearing last night, you should. I know we're here to talk about the new exam. I know we're here to talk about how it's better than the old process and the process in which we determined that we would be using it. But I think the elephant in the room is the fact that we have a system that right now does not allow equitable and fair access to a select group of high schools that we deem to be high quality. And so I think everyone should take a look at his statement. I think we need to understand the history of standardized tests. But whatever decisions we make on a long-term basis, I want to be crystal clear, is absolutely important that we have a process that is robust, not rushed, and allows for families to participate regardless of what side of the issue they're on. And we did not do that well with respect to the decision last night at the school committee. We have an opportunity through this hearing and subsequent conversations to have a more robust conversations about this exam. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. And lastly, I have to keep saying this because it's not getting enough attention. We keep talking about the exam schools, lack of diversity, namely lack of diversity at Boston Latin School. John D. O'Brien and the Latin Academy, folks are like, they're doing pretty good. Non-exam high schools. We need to be talking about them with the same passion and enthusiasm and media coverage that we're doing with respect to our exam high schools. We're not doing that enough, and thousands of students every single day, predominantly students of color and low-income students, are being failed by those schools. And teachers and principals that are working incredibly hard to meet the needs of those students, which are largely special needs students, English language learners, low-income students, are doing incredible work without the resources, without the access to resources that we see with respect to exam schools. Or more importantly, without the attention that they deserve. So I just want to raise that up again, and I'm going to raise it up in every single conversation that we're having on high schools until it gets more attention. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to indulge. Absolutely looking forward to this conversation, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Council President Janey.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I want to thank the makers for bringing this hearing order forward, Councilor Wu, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor Mejia, for their leadership in this space. I also want to thank Councilor Campbell for her partnership around exam school admissions overall. Since I've been on the council, I think people are aware of my advocacy and leadership in this space. Prior to joining the council, while I know we are here to talk about a specific test, I think last night's marathon school committee hearing demonstrates the desire and the demand for a more robust discussion about exam school admissions overall, and not just a test, what that looks like, who is included, who is invited, who has access and opportunity. And it was overwhelming. There was overwhelming demand. Not only that, I will remind everyone on this Zoom that the school committee's own stated policy adopted in 2016, the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Policy, says that the school committee must change its admissions policy to increase diversity. That cannot be done by an exam alone. I think there's lots of opportunity to talk about this exam, whether or not this is a better exam. I think we agree that we think this is a better exam, but what this looks like in an overall new direction. There was a commitment made that the work group would continue and that there would be a robust discussion around that. And so for me, this conversation is very much tied to the long-term admissions question. And so I'm happy to have the conversation about the exam and how we can make sure that this is the right exam to the extent that there'll be an exam as part of the admissions process. And with that, I'd just like to get started. I know there are other colleagues who may want to speak. Thank you for the opportunity, Madam Chair. And thank you to the panelists who have joined the call. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion.
Thank you, Counselor Janey. Carrie, could you let Counselor Flynn in? I know he's waiting in the waiting room and would like to give some opening remarks. Carrie, could you let Counselor Flynn in, please? We're waiting, while we're waiting for Counselor Flynn to join us. Oh, and there he is, just like that, like magic. Counselor Flynn, I'm sorry it took you a few extra minutes to get in with us. If you wouldn't mind giving some brief opening remarks, and then we're going to head over to the panel. Thank you, Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Counselor Asabi George. Thank you for your leadership on this important issue, and to my colleagues as well for their important leadership. I just want to highlight, I know Councilor Campbell highlighted a couple of issues. I just wanted to highlight one issue that I thought might be helpful in this discussion. The important role language access plays in public education, is often not a priority for us, and it has to be a priority for us. We have a large immigrant community in Boston. Many of them don't speak English. And what's important for us as a government is to make sure that they have the services and the support, whether it's immigration support, public education support, language access support, so that they can continue to make progress here in Boston, in our country. And I hope over the next 3 years, over the last 3 years, that was the number one issue I focused on, is language access and giving an opportunity and working closely with our immigrant community. But I just want to highlight the tremendous work our Boston Public School teachers do, but also the professional staff at BPS as well, whether it's the cafeteria workers or the nurses or the janitor or the custodians. They're all working together to provide the best education they can. But that's all I have to say right now, Councilor Asabi George. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Counselor Flynn. And just to remind everyone, we are on a time crunch with Chief Roberts and Ms. Starrett, so I will turn it over to them for presentation. Thank you both for being here, especially after the long night last evening that a few of us were up with you.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair, co-sponsors of this hearing, and members of the council, and to our community joining us online. I want to thank you for inviting us to speak with you this evening regarding the selection of a new assessment for exam school admissions. I have some brief comments, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rachel Starrett, who is the head of school at Boston Latin School. And I think for the record, I do need to state my name. So I am Monica Roberts, and I'm the Chief of Student, Family, and Community Advancement for the Boston Public Schools. As many of you know, in the fall of 2019, the Boston Public Schools began planning to conduct a request for proposal process to secure a test for the exam school's admissions process. The BPS exam school admissions criteria has been 50% GPA and 50% test score using the Independent Secondary School Exam, or ISEE. The district's contract with the ISEE test maker, ERB, was set to expire in June of 2020. The goal of the RFP process was to ensure that there was a test in place by May of 2020 to give families ample notice prior to the test administration for the 2020-2021 school year. The effort to secure a new test was part of ongoing work toward more equitable access to exam schools. It was preceded by an expansion of the exam school initiative in the summer of 2019 and school-based testing for all BPS sixth graders in the fall of 2019. All of these efforts were reviewed and supported by an internal working group comprised of certain departments, including the Office of Opportunity Gaps, the Office of Equity, the Office of Academics, the Office of Data and Accountability, and the Office of Welcome Services. To develop the RFP, BPS participated in an extensive process that included input and recommendations from the internal working group, as well as some feedback through the superintendent's community engagement tour, which she did in her first year of superintendency. Based on this input, we determined that the goal of the RFP would be to secure a fair test that is aligned to the BPS and Massachusetts curriculum standards, reflects that is anti-bias, and measures readiness for a rigorous high school curriculum. We wanted to assess students against what they are learning in school at their grade level so that there wasn't a need for test prep. Equally importantly, we wanted a test that was valid for use with diverse populations. The internal working group created a subcommittee to develop the RFP. This subcommittee used the BPS Racial Equity Planning Tool, which we use for all of our initiatives and processes, to conduct an analysis of the exam school admissions and inform the RFP development and process. To ensure that the equity lens was incorporated into the RFP review process, 4 members of the RFP development subcommittee overlapped with the RFP review committee that actually reviewed all of the proposals that were submitted. The RFP Review Committee included representation from the Office of Student, Family, and Community Advancement, the Office of Data and Accountability, Office of Academics, Office of English Learners, and Office of Special Education. This was based on the capacity to assess proposal quality as related to equitable access, standards alignment, and test administration. I do want to note that the initial process was to include an educator, but there was no response to our first RFP that we put out. So we released the initial RFP on February 17th of this year, inviting organizations to submit their test proposals. The due date for the proposals was March 19th, which was when school buildings closed and were enclosures were being implemented and local governments were issuing stay-home orders due to the national COVID-19 crisis. As a result, Boston Public Schools did not receive any test proposals. The RFP was reissued on April 20th to provide another opportunity for vendors to respond. The due date for that was on May 15th. BPS received 3 proposals for this second round. One was from Strategic Measurement, one was from NWEA, and finally from Riverside Assessments. The 3 proposals were reviewed by the Internal Review Committee, and after their review, they recommended NWEA for the contract. And on July 2nd, the BPS named NWEA as the vendor. There was a press release on July 2nd, followed by communications to families and the broader community. The proposals that were received were evaluated for curriculum standards alignment, validation for use of students with all racial identities, English learners, and students with disabilities, cognitive demand, and rigor. In terms of the proposals that were not selected, one proposal was rated not advantageous, which would recreate a custom assessment for November 2021. That would be next year, and significantly exceeded the district's testing budget. Another proposal was rated advantageous, but the anti-bias analysis and standards alignment was not as robust as the selected vendor. As you are all aware, BPS selected NWEA's proposal to administer its measure of academic progress, or MAP growth assessment, for the exam school admission. Their price proposal was within the district's budget. It was inclusive of all the details and supplementary materials such as Spanish language MAP growth assessment and reading and math. The test is a computer adaptive test. It is untimed. It includes multiple choice and drag and drop options. It provides math, reading, and language arts. It is already familiar to some students within the city, as it is currently used in some of our BPS schools and other schools in the city for formative assessment purposes. Additional factors that led to the selection of the MAP assessment is its alignment to the Mass Curriculum Frameworks, which means it assesses what students are learning in school. Additionally, the test vendor had a robust item bank. Every question is aligned again to standards. And all of their items undergo a review by internal and external specialists for alignment, accuracy, and validity. NWEA provided compelling evidence that the assessment is valid for use with diverse populations as evidenced by a breadth of bias reviews and statistical analyses. The test also included several built-in accommodations for English learners and students with disabilities. There were universal testing tools included, such as a line guide, highlighter, digital notepad, calculators, text-to-speech, and answer eliminator. In light of the pandemic, the superintendent commissioned a working group to make recommendations on the exam school admissions criteria for this school year's choice process. That working group met in August or September of this year and submitted their recommendation to the superintendent on September 29th. The working group's presentation to the school committee was on October 8th, and the school committee voted on that, as noted earlier, last night, October 21st, or actually this morning. The vote included a suspension of current school exam, school admissions processes, which included the administration of the test. So that is my update on the test selection process. I will turn it over to my colleague, Head of Schools, Rachel Starrett.
Thank you, and good afternoon, counselors. My name is Rachel Starrett. I've served as the head of school at Boston Latin School since the fall of 2017. It's always a privilege to work with Ms. Monica Roberts. I'm grateful for her thoughtful facilitation of the working group passed in a short period of time to make a recommendation around exam school admissions for the coming school year. I appreciated listening to and learning from the passionate positions presented by students, families, BPS alumni, and community partners throughout last evening's school committee meeting. It's important that we carve out space to engage in dialogue so that we can listen to multiple perspectives, respectfully challenge perceptions, and use a data and equity-driven process in a way that gives all constituents voice in these conversations. Boston Latin School is a wonderful school. It is not without room for growth, but it is a very special place from which I have benefited as a graduate and where I first became an educator when I finished college and returned to alma mater to become an English teacher to 7th graders in 1999. I know firsthand why folks are so passionate and engaged about access to this place of rigorous learning and tremendous opportunity. In addition, having spent years now collaborating with and learning from Dr. Tanya Freeman-Wisdom at the John D. O'Brien and Mr. Chimdi Uchendu and Mr. Jerry Howland at Boston Latin Academy, I can also say that I have had the opportunity to see how incredible all 3 exam schools are. This debate about admissions is personal to so many of us. Because our city is small and Boston's history of racial inequity runs deep, there isn't a single person from Boston who doesn't have some personal touch point to one of these 3 schools. You, a friend, a cousin, your child, and those experiences may range from immensely positive to deeply traumatic. The fact that our individual connections to these institutions are personal doesn't mean that our work to strengthen them can't be respectful and productive. Today, I've been asked to come to speak to the diversity at BLS and what we are doing to ensure that students feel welcomed and affirmed, particularly our students of color. While it is well known and of deep concern to all of us that Boston Latin School's student demographics do not mirror the proportional racial diversity of the city itself, I want to highlight a few things about our student body. Our current enrollment is 2,484 students in grades 7 through 12. BLS is 56% students of color with a population that is 8% Black, 14% Latinx, 29% Asian, and 5% multiracial. Students hail from every section of the city and represent over 85 sending schools. Close to 500 of our students, 491 to be exact, are former English learners in BPS. 1 in 3 of this year's seniors will be first-generation college students. And while BLS used to be a school during BLA, head of schools Jerry Howland's time, when hundreds of students transferred before they got to graduate, our retention of students from year to year is 98%, according to the DESE data, among the highest high school rates in the state. Lastly, as we are a school whose mission focuses on college preparedness, In reviewing our data in Naviance from 2017 to 2020, over 95% of our students enrolled in a four-year college or military, and Black and Latinx graduates matriculated at the same rate as their white and Asian peers. I'm incredibly proud of my students, a few of whom spoke at yesterday's meeting, for their ongoing work as activists and agents of change. Many saw the advocacy and drive of our students in 2016 when members of BLS Black brought attention to the experiences and challenges of being Black at BLS, a school where it is not uncommon to be the only Black or brown person, or one of few, in an academic or extracurricular space. Our students continue to use their voices in service of an affirming school culture, not just for themselves, but for all identity groups. Yesterday, we held day 3 of 5 of our virtual extracurricular showcase, and the student leaders from all of our cultural clubs and affinity groups held an informational Zoom for prospective members. This included the groups Black Leaders Aspiring for Change and Knowledge, BLS Black, Talented and Gifted Latino Program, TAG, Asian Students in Action, Asia, Vietnamese Student Society, Filipino Club, Arab Students Association, Gender Sexuality Alliance, GSA, and the list goes on. It was incredibly inspiring to see them lift each other up, coming to support one another's initiatives and projects, and finding opportunities to collaborate across clubs. Many of their planned and former projects include education and enrichment for the entire school community, such as the school-wide video produced by BLS TAG that was viewed by all students just a few weeks ago in recognition of Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month. I am happy to answer questions that you might have around our policies, practices, and evolution at BLS, though I do have back to school night later this evening. But I'd like to focus in these comments on suggestions that were made by our students themselves, as listening to them and considering them partners in this work is essential to fostering an environment of trust and respect at the high school level, among students and between students and staff. Last spring, BLS Black shared with our administrative team a list of suggested areas of focus for the coming year that included student involvement and cultural responsiveness efforts, an improved reporting structure for bias-based incidents, ongoing training and PD for faculty and staff, and opportunities for mentorship, among others. Many of these same ideas, as well as additional ones, were highlighted in the activism of BLS seniors Mandy Sun and Sarah Shu, who were featured in the Globe last month for their work urging school districts to address anti-Asian racism that has surged during this COVID-19 pandemic. In their open letter shared with district leadership in Boston, Malden, and Quincy, they and other members of the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Youth Center lift up recommendations, such as publicly speaking out for anti-racism, revising current curricular materials, hiring more Black, Indigenous, and people of color on school staffs and faculty, prioritizing mental and emotional health resources, and committing to actively engaging and supporting families. I know that BPS leaders in the Office of Equity and Office of Opportunity Gaps are reviewing these recommendations and are eager to be responsive to the work of our youth leaders. I'd like to conclude before taking questions, along with my colleague, Ms. Roberts, by saying that while I'm always happy to discuss BLS, share our successes and challenges, and receive feedback, I also want to echo the sentiments expressed last night and earlier at this hearing regarding the need for this level of attention and passion for all of our district schools. Before I led BLS, I was the proud principal of Eastern Senior High School in Washington, D.C., a federal turnaround school that was 99% Black, and once went through 13 principals in 12 years and experienced a shooting in the school's cafeteria. During my time, we successfully implemented the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program and increased graduation rates to its highest levels in school history. I do know what it's like to lead a school with amazingly talented students who have not been given what they need in order to be successful. And I know what it feels like when a city's conversation doesn't feel like it includes you. We have an incredible set of school leaders across this district, and I just would like to acknowledge all of their hard work 24/7 in their respective school communities last spring, all summer, and ongoing during this unprecedented time of crisis and reckoning for our city and country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Chief Roberts and Ms. Starrett, for your comments tonight. And I do know your time is brief, so I won't ask any specific questions unless we have a little time at the end. But I do want to just echo, I think it was Councilor Campbell who said it first, and Ms. Starrett just echoed the need to make sure that we are also focused and investing in our district high schools. I'm very proud of the years I spent teaching at East Boston High School, but it's also about our middle schools and their future, investing in our elementary schools, and investing in early education. We see how desperately important that is right now, and how supporting our youngest children and our students at the highest levels of need is, especially at this time. So I think that it is a greater conversation than just about the exam schools. I should also note for the record that I am a graduate of Boston Technical High School, which is now the John D. O'Brien School of Math and Science. So I am gonna go over to one of the lead sponsors first, Councilor Arroyo. I am going to ask, just in the interest of time, that you ask perhaps some really quick questions, as Ms. Roberts does have to leave in the next few minutes. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And what I'll do is I'll ask the questions to both of you, and then that way the questions are out, and then you can just answer them back both. And I will just say one thing. Obviously, we can hold hearings on any topic. Anybody here can bring forward a hearing on anything. And I agree that we should be talking about all of our high schools, but the reality remains that there's only 3 high schools in the city of Boston that are subject to racist and classist gatekeeping. And those are the 3 that we're talking about today. The other ones don't have the same racist and classist gatekeeping. And so when we are talking about these 3, it's specifically because of that. And we can like move around that however we want to move around that. But I'm not going to allow the reality that that's what is happening to go by unsaid. And what I mean by that is, Principal Starrett, I'm really glad that you're here. I really am. And I'm really glad that you're the principal at BLS. I'm thrilled about that. But the reality is, when you said your numbers, as far as diversity goes, 7.6% at BLS is 23% less than what the average of Black and African Americans in BPS, the system as a whole, is. 13% Hispanic Latino population in BLS, when the population at BLS, when the population at BPS is 42%, is striking. And the reason for that is because of this exam school culture, is because of the way in which we do this. And frankly, in looking at the attrition rates, and this hasn't really been remarked upon, and I'll just remark on it briefly, it's easier for me to find an alum of color from BLS who speaks to me about the racial environment there and how unacceptable it was for them personally and the traumas in which they have dealt with that, than it is for me to find one who doesn't. In my own personal life, as somebody who attended the O'Brien, as somebody who has 2 brothers who attended BLS and a sister who graduated from BLA. And so I don't want to skate away from a conversation about what the racial environment is and what that does to attrition numbers, or what the gatekeeping to these schools is. And so with that in mind, and this is for both, because I don't know who has this information, but first question, the NWEA MAPS test is being used here to rank students, not as an assessment tool in the way that NWEA MAPS is generally used, which is to essentially assess growth for a student. So that's why my understanding is that they're creating an exam specifically tailored for this entrance selection process. A high stakes exam is what that would be, as opposed to a low stakes exam, which is an assessment exam. A high stakes exam because it's banking on whether or not you enter into these schools. Are either of you aware of any examination that does not have a disproportionate amount of people of color or lower on the socioeconomic scale folks on the back end doing worse on that exam? Are any of you aware of a standardized exam that does that?
I promised myself I was going to let Ms. Roberts answer all the NWEA questions, because I still can't figure out why I'm on a panel for NWEA, because I promised I had no participation. But I do want a Councilor Arroyo, because I know our time is limited, and I will let Ms. Roberts answer the question in the broad sense. I think that I'm glad that we're talking about our complex relationships with tests as a city as well. I think that we cannot ignore the fact that at the same time that we talk about the challenges with tests, we prescribe standardized tests as a solution to adding rigor in our comprehensive high schools. One of the tools that is being recommended to improve some of the other schools around the city that Councilor Campbell is referring to is to implement AP, right? Which is an exam from the College Board. And we opened our schools this week, across the city, not just at BLS, because many seniors wanted the opportunity to take the SAT, even though many schools are rightfully test optional this year, and some may argue maybe they should just be test optional. But we do have a relationship where we are advocating testing in some situations and not in others. And I don't say that to have an answer to your question. And no, I do not know of any standardized test where BIPOC folks are exceeding in performance, to answer your question. But I just want to articulate that point to emphasize why I think these dialogues are so important to have and really peel back multiple layers, because I think that if these questions were easy to solve around these schools, they wouldn't bring up such passion, and we would have done it hopefully as a city, maybe not. But I just wanted to make that point that our city has other complicated relationships with testing beyond these schools as well. But I'll let Ms. Roberts.
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert in standardized testing, so I will not pretend to be able to have the full knowledge of all the universe of tests used in the country. So I'm going to not respond to that, but I will say, just want to clarify that the NWEA MAP test as it relates to exam school testing is not being created or customized for BPS. They already have a selective admissions test. It is used by Chicago Public Schools, Kansas, and Metro Nashville. That is what they propose to use with us. So just wanted to clarify that for everyone.
And in terms of, and this is my final question in sake of time.
Sorry, and I do want to, Councilor Roy, just very quickly, we are at 5 o'clock, which I committed to Ms. Roberts, Chief Roberts, that she could leave at 5. So if you've got actually a question very much directed to Chief Roberts,
Very much directed to Roberts, yeah. It's about what you just said. Chicago, you're saying, uses this as an assessment. In Chicago, the way that they use this exam as an assessment for getting into their selected admission schools, is it a carbon copy mirror of what BPS is proposing we do with it? Is the exact same way in which it's being used in conjunction with other things, exact mirror of the way BPS is seeking to do this? Or are we doing it differently than the way Chicago does it, if that makes sense? And that's my final question.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's different than how Chicago uses it. I actually think all of those 3 districts use the testing, that particular test, differently.
And just if you could tell us how we're going to use it.
We're not going to use it as of this moment due to the school committee vote, right? And so next year, the current policy, which is being suspended, is that you do 50% GPA, 50% tests. That is the current policy that is currently suspended for 1 year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Chief Roberts, would you mind indulging us in one more level of questions just so we can get through the lead sponsors? Councilor Mejia, Mejia, if you could direct them to Ms. Chief Roberts just as much as possible so we can send her on her way.
I got you. So Chief Roberts, it's so good to see you. I'm just curious about how the district determines that a test is anti-bias. Like Councilor Arroyo mentioned, I cannot think of a test where Black and Brown students score equally or better than their white counterparts. What are those standards and what groups participate in determining that? I'm just curious about how we got there. And how does the district determine that a test is good for English language learners? Are tests provided in multiple languages? And what do you mean when you say 50% GPA and 50% tests? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take the last one first because that might be simpler. The district for grade 7, for example, uses the last term of a student's 5th grade year and the first term of their 6th grade year to as their, what I would just call grades or their GPA, as 50% of what they would call a Z-score or a composite score. The other 50% of that score is used, it comes from their test, the results and how they scored, that is combined to create what we call a Z-score and then rank students. As it relates to NWEA's submission of evidence regarding bias and other things, but they submitted what was called a differential item functioning analysis, which was completed to assess whether items are fair to students of different subgroups. Every item is examined at multiple points in the development process, undergoing specific bias and sensitivity reviews. And then they have a committee composed of external folks who deem the analysis, who conduct the review process. When we talk about the sensitivity review, and I apologize for all the test jargon, I don't know if my colleagues.
I know. I don't think you could read my nonverbal communication. I'm getting lost in all of that.
It's basically they conduct an analysis that assesses whether it's fair to students of different groups. They assess whether a student taking the test has equal opportunity to answer them correctly based solely on their knowledge of the item content. Anything that is found not to be to be sensitive or fair is actually eliminated. Things that they think about is if it requires prior knowledge or something that a student would not have learned in school, requires constructive or relevant or specialized knowledge, if it has cultural bias or linguistic bias or socioeconomic bias, religious bias, geographic bias, colorblind bias, gender bias, favor students who have no visual impairments. These are all things they look for to conduct their bias assessment. If it favors students who have disabilities, then those are removed from the testing items.
Is there a copy of the test somewhere we could just take a look at it? I'd like to just test myself to see how smart I am.
NWEA actually they do not do a full practice test, but on their website, they do include a few sample questions. I think it's up to 5 by grade level. Their intention is not to give people a full practice test, but to help them understand the test environment and type of questions that they will receive. So I think you can access them right on their website.
Because this looks like any kind of test that you could potentially administer. So I was just trying to figure out what was particularly special about this test that helps us assess. I'm looking at growth mind. I just feel like there's so many things when you're thinking about children who haven't had access to opportunity, children who speak a different language at home. There are a lot of superpowers that we have that there's really no way for us to assess what the unique capabilities that we bring into a space, right? And so, but I appreciate your answer, and I know that you have to go, and I don't mind, Councilor Sabi George. I can wait for my questions for Rachel and let Councilor Wu ask any questions that she has of Monica Roberts, if that's okay.
Great, I appreciate that, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Wu, do you have a brief question for Chief Roberts? Because I've already overextended her, and I know Ms. Starrett also has a family night at Latin this evening.
Thank you. I just have 2 questions, and I'll keep them very quick. So one is on the actual test. This is a test that looks like there are, I just was Googling it, there are still test prep books available for it. There's still a test prep industry related to this MAP test. What is the district thinking about that type of prep? I mean, we know it's not just the bias related to individual questions, but the ability for families or to have access to that preparation. Is the plan to roll out more sort of early, the equivalent of Excellence for All or prep related to now MAP, or how are you thinking about test prep with this new test?
Yeah, so what I can say is that as it relates to district-based testing support, that has been traditionally done through our ESI program. So, and I apologize, I'm forgetting what ESI stands for. Ms. Starrett, if you don't. My exam school initiative. Thank you, where we do provide additional support to our students. Mostly we teach them about, we ran it this summer in July, and we really helped our students understand in particular what are the questions asking you to do to help them think about how they approach the questions. Because of how the MAP growth test is designed, the traditional kind of this is how you answer this sort of question doesn't actually work in the same way, and Ms. Hogan might be able to talk a little bit more about that. And because it is a computer adaptive test, you can't go back to a prior question, right? So a lot of the traditional ways that people think about test prep is not something that you would do with this test. We have maintained that one of the reasons why we selected this test is because it is aligned to the district and state curriculum standards. And therefore, if we are preparing our students well in school, they should be well prepared for the exam. And if the test, or as we look forward to a test, we would be then looking at what does that mean for ESI and how ESI would actually have to shift.
I might get some of these test prep books and just check it out to see what it says inside there. Okay, second question is on how to operationalize this. So if the district hypothetically were moving towards administering this test for the first time, whether it's, whichever school year next or the one after that or whenever, how many months or weeks in advance does that need to be finalized in order to do all the planning, in order to administer the sites, or kind of when would we know that decision needs to be made by to plan ahead logistically and to give families some certainty?
Yeah, so we usually start our process in the spring of each year in preparation for the coming school year. So I would expect that would be the same timeline. Again, we were planning on doing school-based testing to support all BPS students. So I would expect that to be the same as well.
So we know by this next spring if it's going to be administered the fall after that.
So that is a question for the Boston School Committee. I am saying that in terms of our process and our timeline, we generally are sharing information and starting to plan in the spring.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu, and I thank you, Chief Roberts and Ms. Starrett, for your time today. I do know that you have to jump off. Carrie, I'd like to bring in the next panel, and we'll continue with questions through the next panel. And because we are losing Chief Roberts and Ms. Starrett, I would ask that colleagues submit their questions to me and to the makers if you'd like, but to me, and we will make sure to follow up with those questions to the school department through Chief Roberts' office to get answers to those questions, because I have a few myself and we'll just compile them and add them to the list. So I'm going to thank the two of you. We're going to bring in the second panel and go from there.
I know that young lady. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Starrett. So we do have panel number 2 that includes one of our great students here in Boston who will, I'm just going to make sure that I get to my my right notes so I introduce the panel appropriately. So next we have Zoe Nagasawa, who's a senior at Boston Latin School, as well as Ashley Carey, who's a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. They have a presentation to share with us, and then we will go back through our questions. So Zoe, I'm gonna turn this over to you. I don't know if Peter is with you as well. He's not on my list if he is.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us as a panelist this evening. My name is Ashley Carey, and I'm a PhD student at UMass Lowell. My co-presenter, Zoe Nagasawa, is a senior at Boston Latin, and she was placed at CCE this summer through the CVAC Fellowship Program. Tonight, we will be presenting the Cliff Notes version of our research report on strategies for creating racial equity in Boston's exam schools. Our third co-author, Peter Piazza, regrettably can't make it this evening due to a family engagement. For our report, we drew on multiple data sources, including a review of specialized school policies in other cities, as well as 33 interviews with BLS students and administrators, as well as civil rights activists and others in the BLS community. Black and Latinx students continue to be underrepresented at Boston's public exam schools. Much of this inequity is driven by the demography of Boston Latin School, BLS. Black and Latinx students comprise only 7.6% and 13.3% of Boston Latin School during the 2019-2020 school year, compared to 30% and 42.2% of citywide enrollment. BLS contributes the most to school segregation in Boston by a long shot. Even though we are focusing on BLS, the composition of one school affects segregation district-wide. You can see that illustrated in the screenshot from the Urban Institute on the right. This is an online tool created by Urban Institute that allows you to see how much any single school contributes to segregation in the district as a whole. A taller line on the graph denotes a greater contribution to segregation district-wide. The pink balloon and tallest line is BLS. The problem is racial inequity in BPS exam school admissions, which is caused by a citywide competition for exam school seats that disadvantages Black and Latinx students and low-income students. Our solution is to create a level playing field by considering socioeconomic status in exam school admissions. In our report, we identified 2 alternative systems for exam school admissions. Option 1 is neighborhood-based admission. Option 2 is school-based admission. Tonight, we will focus on option 1. Option 1 operates on socioeconomic tiers. This system is loosely based on Chicago's model for selective high school admissions. We recommend the following for usage in Boston. Each Boston census tract is assigned a socioeconomic index according to factors such as mean family income and the percentage of single-family homes. Census tracts are organized into 4 tiers according to their SES index, each with roughly the same number of school-age children. For instance, Tier 1 would contain the lowest SES census tracts, Tier 4 would contain the highest. Students only compete against peers in their SES tier, as opposed to competing against all students in the city of Boston. The top 25% of students from each tier are offered admissions to BPS exam schools. The image on the right maps out the tier system in Chicago. Note that the tiers are not geographically contiguous, which allows for greater flexibility in how the socioeconomic tiers are set up. Chicago also refreshes the tiers each year to capture demographic shifts. A common question or critique that comes up with this system is, what about low-income students in high-income neighborhoods? Chicago has a workaround for this. Up to 5% of seats at each restricted enrollment school is reserved for principal discretion. Students from low-income families and gentrifying communities can apply directly with a personal essay. Finally, and most importantly, we cannot talk about increasing the representation of Black and Latinx students at BLS without also addressing their experiences at school. Because the admission system is based on student preference, schools need to create a welcoming culture or students will opt, understandably, not to attend those schools. I'm going to hand the mic over to Zoe now to talk more about our findings on race and school culture at BLS.
Great, thank you. While you're doing that, I do want to just note that we've also been joined by Counselor Edwards. Thank you for allowing the interruption. Go ahead, Zoe.
Thank you. To learn about the racial dynamics at BLS, we interviewed a racially diverse group of BLS students who outlined some of the problems they've experienced and the causes of those problems, as well as some of their recommendations for addressing racism at Boston Latin. The problem that all students we interviewed identified is the harsh and unwelcoming culture at BLS, which hits Black and Latinx students especially hard as they are forced to navigate microaggressions and incidents of overt racism. One student, as referenced in the quote to the right, identified the dichotomy between the school's mission around social justice and the real actions of some of the students. In this environment, Black and Latinx students often feel isolated and unwelcome. Interviewees identified the root cause of that problem as the competitive and individualistic school culture, which has long been defined by white supremacy culture. Students have expressed deep appreciation for the changes that have already been made to BLS's culture since the original Black at BLS movement in 2016, particularly the changes that head of school Rachel Starrett has brought about in the past couple of years. But they also emphasize the work that still needs to be done. Some of the recommendations for that work are outlined here, and they include increasing the number of Black and Latinx faculty, creating a mentorship program for students from historically marginalized groups, providing supports to students of color at key transition points in their academic trajectory, especially at their entry to BLS and during the college admission process, and ensuring conversations on race occur regularly in the classroom, including the implementation of a more diverse, less Eurocentric curriculum. Many of these points have already been brought up by Head of School Rachel Starrett.
Thank you, everyone. That's what we have for our presentation. We also have our contact info here if you want to reach out with any questions later that aren't answered this evening.
Ashley and Zoe, thank you very much. And thank you to Peter, who wasn't able to join us, for his contributions to this. Colleagues, and again, and from the lead sponsors and then in order of arrival, if you would, by a show of hands, perhaps indicate whether you have questions for either Ashley, Zoe, or Zoe. We'll start with Councilor Arroyo.
Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes, you are.
First and foremost, thank you so much for conducting this study, for bringing us this data, and for presenting here today. You know, unfortunately, the experiences that you documented on page 10 of this report are well known to me. I attended the John D. O'Brien. I had friends growing up and peers who went to BNA and BLS and have given me sort of these horror stories of experiences that they've had that nobody deserves in any place, but certainly not in those that we hold up so high as BLS. And so my question to you all, because I think the title of your report was Uneven Ground. And I think that's really the root of what we're all trying to get to here, which is the process for allowing people into these schools is uneven. And so as we talk about that, was there any specific model that you saw that you believed was a better model overall out of these multiple models that you saw? And also, just from a personal aspect on top of that, is there a model, or would you support a model that removed a standardized examination requirement?
Would you like us both to answer?
Whoever feels so inclined. If both of you would like to answer with your own separate answers, or one part or the other part, that's fine. Whoever.
Sure. I can go first, and then I'll let Zoe chime in on her personal perspective on whether or not to use an exam. So personally, I, as an individual, recognize the issues with standardized examinations and how they correlate with student demography. And I hope that someday we won't be using exams. That being said, as a co-author on this report, having spoken to lots of people in the BLS community, including students and including Black and Latinx students, I was surprised by how many of them would like to keep an exam. So understanding that want for an exam from the community, I think the Chicago method could work in Boston. It's not perfect. I don't think it would get us all of the way there, but it would certainly be a marked increase in terms of representation racially in the exam schools from what we have. Zoe, do you want to chime in either on the report or your personal perspective on the exam?
Sure. I will say that out of all of the systems that we looked at, I don't believe that any other cities in the US with selective admission schools have a process that does not include a standardized test, but that the Chicago system does have the most representative demographics in their selective schools that matches the demographics of their city. I think, in my own opinion, I think it can be and should be possible that selective admission schools are fair and based not on a standardized test, but again, I did not find any examples that already exist, and I'm not sure how feasible that would be in Boston at this moment, especially since, as Ashley said, a lot of the people who we interviewed, including Black and Latinx students at the exam schools, are not necessarily in support of removing the test.
And to be clear, just on what you've said, specifically you spoke to, like your group that you were speaking to were students who had already taken the exam and were part of these exam communities, and they thought the exam made sense for them.
Yes.
Got it. In terms of, and this is my final question on this part of it, in terms of the way that BPS currently has planned, and obviously we have a 1-year pause due to the pandemic, right? So I'm talking about more long-term. The way that BPS currently has it, where it is a 50% GPA, 50% exam-based process. In your personal opinion, based on the research you've done, based on what you know, is that something that is going to lead to racial equity issues down the line and more of these socioeconomic equity issues if it remains 50% a test, 50% just straight GPA?
I would say that if our goal is to have schools that are representative of the citywide population or school age population, that I don't know a test and GPA are going to get us there.
Thank you. That's it. I think your report speaks for itself in terms of what you had for some suggestions, so I won't ask any questions there. But thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia.
Sorry, Councilor Sapi George, I also wanted to let my co-sponsors know that I squeezed this particular situation when we were trying to figure out the date, and I said I was going to be making this work. I'm just curious, and I'll be holding my questions so that I can move this along as fast as I can. But I do have a hard stop. I'm just curious about what the process looks like, how many people we have lined up, and how many more questions we have to go, so that way I can determine whether or not I'm even going to say anything at this point.
I'm sorry, you as the lead sponsors have 4 panels altogether. This is a second panel as well as public testimony.
I will be jumping in and out of this conversation at some point. So I'm just getting my colleagues a head up in regards to the scheduling. I try to be as
We
accommodating.
understand, Councilor Mejia, that do you have questions for Ashley and Zoe?
And I do. Can you talk about the process of Chicago youth getting to their exam? Like,
Yes.
how did we get to that? And what can we learn from other cities?
So do you mean the
I don't really understand.
process that they use? Would you like us to describe the process that Chicago uses? Okay, so Chicago uses student grades and exam scores, and those are sort of the inputs into their system. And then the system itself, so I was going to go back to, so those are the 2 inputs. And then they use the socioeconomic tiers as sort of the mechanism to decide who gets invitations to the school. So students are only competing against other students that are inside of their socioeconomic tier. And the socioeconomic tiers are determined by their census tract. So that is designed so that students who live in predominantly Black or Latinx communities aren't having to compete against students in other neighborhoods in Chicago.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both the presenters for your work and for being with us tonight. I'm curious to think about how you think the city should be approaching this year's, sort of immediate change and how that should affect how we think about future years. What kind of data should the city be really intentional about making sure we are measuring? What kind of outcomes do you think should affect how we make decisions about years that are after the pandemic? Just open to your thoughts.
I think it's really difficult in a 1-year time span to see how things will change, especially in terms of school culture. But I think it would obviously be important to see how the demographics shift with the proposal. But I do think that school culture is such a large portion of this, and that's not something that we can sort of just come up with a new system and hope for the best, and it's going to take a lot of purposeful work. I'm also going to let Zoe chime in. I don't know if you have anything you want to say, Zoe.
No, I don't think I have much further to add.
And then my other question is on, you teased us with the multiple options at the beginning and then only went through one of them here. Is there anything that you would say relative to the school-based admission that Boston should be thinking about as we are going through the process of planning out longer term changes potentially?
Certainly. So Boston is tricky because we have such a large proportion of exam school students coming from private schools. So a lot of the systems that are used in other school districts rely on taking a top percentage of performers from each elementary school, for instance. But that sort of a system doesn't allow for students that are attending parochial or private schools to be included. I think BLS, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's currently 40% of their students attended private schools prior to admissions. So I think that's something else we need to think about. Sensitivity around how we handle admissions and the types of schools that students attended before, and also making sure that all of our students, regardless of where they went to elementary school, have a fair shot at attending these schools. So did you want to add anything? Sorry, Zoe, I just want to make sure I'm giving you space to speak.
Yeah, I think I would like to note that some proposals that the Boston branch of the NAACP did prefer the school-based admission system over the neighborhood-based admission system, but that during our own interviews, we did find that the neighborhood-based admission system was more popular in the 33 people that we interviewed.
Got it. And then for Zoe in particular, is there anything that you think we haven't talked about so far that policymakers should have in mind as we're talking about this issue?
I think it's important to me to re-emphasize student voice in these proceedings. So as this body moves forward and as the decision about exam school admissions in general moves forward, I think it is important to get input from students who attend the exam schools, as well as students who do not attend the exam schools, to get a comprehensive view on what the student perspective is in Boston.
Great. Thank you both very much.
And do any of my other colleagues have questions for Ashley or Zoe? I have one quick question. When you look through your work, and congratulations on this work, it's very impressive and very thorough. Did you look at the impact in, say, Chicago, for example, on perhaps other selective admission type schools that didn't use exams? We have a number of schools in the city of Boston that are application based, but not necessarily test based or exam based. And I'm curious about their impact on enrollment and invitation versus enrollment, because there are some discrepancies between invitation versus enrollment as well at selective schools.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So are you asking about the difference between processes where someone has to sort of seek it out versus just inviting students, like a certain subset of students, to apply?
Well, that's also an interesting question, different from what I'm asking. We have a number of schools in Boston that are application based. So similar to the exam, you do have to, an exam school, you do have to be, there's a level of proactiveness into applying for those schools, and whether it's family based or school based, pushing a student to make that application. I'm curious about the impact those schools have in this in sort of this, like, how does it impact all of it when we think about, because in Boston, we have, I think, several layers of types of schools. We have exam schools and, the three that we're talking about today. We have admission, also selected schools through an admissions process. Each of those schools, their process varies slightly in what the credentials are for admission. And then we have what we consider open enrollment schools. And they are the process to enter into any one of those schools, whether it's through application or accepting of invitation once an application or a test has been taken, all of that. All of those components impact each other. And I'm curious if there was any study to the role of non-exam yet still selective admission schools on enrollment across the district, and in this case, across Chicago, or any school district.
Yep, I don't recall any specific data that speaks to that. Obviously, there's a wide range of sort of inputs that districts put into their systems, from interviews to personal essays to exams. Zoe, can you recall if we found any data that sort of measured out how these different inputs turn out?
No, we did not.
That's something that I will ask the district too, because they have that data here in Boston, sort of where our kids go. We don't always understand fully the why certain students and families select or accept an invitation to schools, because there is also a disconnect even through the exam schools with the invitation to attend goes out, and why some students choose not to attend. And that's an interesting study. I think it's an important study to understand that. Part of the reason, I think, is some of the cultural, the experiences within the school culture that impact whether or not a student decides to accept an invitation to a particular school. Also the perception of whether it's the best school or it's a second ranked school or the third ranked school through those conversations. Do any of my colleagues have any additional questions for Zoe and Ashley before we move on to panel 3? I see Councillor Braden, and then we'll go back to Councillor Arroyo. Councillor Braden?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to drill down a little more on the issue of the private school, disproportionate representation of private students coming in from private schools. How did Chicago deal with that situation?
So the percentage, if I remember correctly, in Chicago, it's much lower than it is in Boston. Chicago also is in a little bit different of a position because geographically, Chicago is quite large compared to Boston, which is much more condensed. So in Chicago, a student is not going to go out of their way to go to an exam school on the other side of Chicago. Whereas in Boston, just because things are just much more closer and the city is geographically smaller, we see more of that. So I think there's a couple different factors that sort of feed into why we have so many private school students in Boston exam schools.
Is there any model for weighting that would give preference to students who have come up through the BPS system rather than leaving? Like it's such a huge number. Is there a way to weight it that students who come up through the BPS system would be given a weighting percentage on a test or something? Like it just seems maybe
So there's two ways to deal with that. The first is to allow a certain percentage of seats to be open enrollment. They can sort of go to anybody. And then to reserve a certain number of seats for students that attend the public schools within the district. So maybe you say 30% of seats go to anybody, regardless of where you attended school. And then the remaining percentage are based on the state exam, like the MCAS. So that would limit who is able to fill those other seats. Zoe, do you recall any systems that used weighting? I saw you nodding your head, so you might be thinking of something else.
No, we didn't find any specific examples of districts that used weighting, but it was something that we thought about as we wrote this report. And some suggestions included, as you said, adding a couple of percentage points weight to test scores or GPA. But no, there were no concrete examples of any district doing that we found.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Councilor Breeden. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you very much. And I just have one follow-up question. I know you looked at selective admission schools in specific cities, but one of the models that I've always looked at as a potential model for Boston is the University of Texas model, which is legislated, where it's the top 10% rule that they have, where top percentages of every high school, private or public, in the state of Texas have a automatic admission process. I think there's a couple other pieces to it, but it's basically top 10%. They change the number specifically for who gets into, say, the University of Texas Austin, which is the flagship. And so if you're in the top 7% or 6%, then you might have automatic admission there. If you're in the top 6 to 10, you might have automatic admission to another one. But it is spread out across privates and publics. It sort of seems to me, if we did something similar in BPS, if we did something where every BPS school had a certain percentage of their top learners given specific automatic admission to these schools, we would deal with a lot of the socioeconomic issues. We would deal with a lot of the racial inequity issues. Was there any analysis of, because I see you nodding both that you're aware of the system in Texas, was there any analysis of that kind of system being used in the city of Boston specifically for our exam schools?
I'm trying to think, Zoe, when we only looked at the census tract tiers, correct? Did we look into elementary schools? I can't remember if we started trying to analyze that.
So yes, we did try to analyze the data, but because a lot of it is not publicly available, we weren't able to complete a simulation that fully told us what would happen if we used a top percentage from each school model.
We're happy to share the start we did. We started trying to replicate a few different things using Boston Public School data, but obviously we don't have access to some things that are shielded from the public, but we're happy to share Google files if you'd find that helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, all of that's helpful. And just thank you again for your time and for the work that you've done. I've always found the University of Texas's system interesting for these kinds of issues. And it's not, it's less complicated in some ways than some of these other ones that do a lot of different algorithms. And I think that's really what we get down to, is how we look at these algorithms to get these numbers and these sort of equal opportunity access, equal access things taken care of. So thank you, both of you, sincerely.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Does anyone else have questions for Ashley or Zoe? I do want to note that as we move, I'm sorry, Councilor Campbell does have questions. I want to note to participants who are raising their hands in the participant folder, we are not arriving to public testimony yet. So if you've got something burning that you need to share, feel free to email me at a.e.george@boston.gov. Councilor Campbell, and then we'll move to panel 3. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of you for the report. It's extremely helpful, and it adds to the long list of ideas on the table with respect to transforming this system. So thank you. I wanted to just quickly go back to the cultural piece, which I appreciated you raising up in your presentation, particularly in the importance of student voice in this. And I think in some conversations or at some tables, that piece is often lost. Of how significant it is. So I'm curious, and maybe I missed this, what are more specific things we could do as a district, for example, to support school leaders? I know Ms. Starrett was on here, obviously, and she does her best and sometimes in a very difficult environment, frankly, when she's trying to push equity and making decisions through an equity lens, but how we might support leaders and teachers and students when they're attempting to shift culture in many of these exam schools to maintain retention, not only of the student body, but also of the staff.
I mean, I think the number one item on the list of recommendations from the students we spoke to was increasing the number of Black and Latinx faculty rather. So I think any way that the district can help schools to actively recruit Black and Latinx faculty and then to retain Black and Latinx faculty would certainly be one good way to start addressing the issue of culture.
To add to that, a lot of the students that I spoke to were frustrated sometimes about the lack of transparency that they get from the district. And that's something that I'd like to emphasize on their behalf. Just ask for more transparency as processes that affect our education move forward.
Thank you. I think everyone's asking for that these days, Zoe, but thank you both. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. And I think that's it for Ashley and Zoe. Thank you very much for your presentation, your work. And Zoe, thank you very much and congratulations on not just pulling this together and doing this work, but very thoughtfully and thoroughly and impressively presenting it here before the Boston City Council. Thank you, Zoe. Next, we're going to go to our third panel. And that includes Tanisha Sullivan, president of the NAACP, Boston Branch NAACP, and Lauren Sampson, who is the staff attorney for the Lawyers for Civil Rights, and Ruby Reyes, director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance, also known as BEJA. Thank you for joining us. And I know also a number of you were on late last evening, so I do appreciate you coming back for another round today. I'm not sure who we'll start with, but Ms. Sullivan, you were first on my list, so I'm going to start with you.
It's great, wonderful. Thank you, Chair Asabi George. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to the co-sponsors of this particular hearing, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor Mejia, and Councilor Wu. Thank you to the rest of the council for being present here this afternoon or this evening. I'd like to really just intro the conversation because I'm joined on this panel by two partners in this work, Lawyers for Civil Rights, represented by Lauren Sampson, and BEJA, represented by Ruby Reyes. So I'll just begin with some opening comments to just level set from a timeline standpoint. As many know, the NAACP Boston branch has been intimately involved in the fight for equal access and opportunity in our public education system, literally for generations. But we can take it back about 50 years at the start of our desegregation movement here in Boston. And since that time, since the late 60s, early 70s, one of the issues with respect to education equity that the Boston branch has been actively monitoring is access to our exam schools in the city of Boston. That work has continued. You fast forward to 2014, when the Boston Public Schools commissioned its Opportunity and Achievement report, which was written in part by CCE. So it's good to see them, of course, once again, that really highlighted many of the ongoing equity challenges within Boston Public Schools. One of them, access to our exam schools. In 2015, Black at BLS really set our city ablaze once again, and really called to our collective attention the ongoing challenges in many of our exam schools, but specifically within BLS as it relates not only to student representation and diversity, but also teachers and faculty. So I appreciate that being lifted in the last panel as well. In 2015, the Boston branch really dug deep in earnest with many of our civil rights and education justice advocate partners to take an even closer look at what could be done in both the, at that point in time, current legal, policy, and political climates to bring about greater racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and geographic diversity to our exam schools. Again, one of the many issues that our organization focuses on when it comes to providing all children with access to a high quality public education. As part of that work, and I'm sure Lauren will talk a bit about this, we worked with LCR, ACLU, MAC, Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts to research what the current, at that point in time, climate was across the country, what other cities and towns, cities and districts were doing at the time. We produced a white paper, well-researched white paper on the topic, but most importantly, and I'd say notably for this conversation, is we embarked on something that had not been done before, in that we took this work literally around our city. And provided neighborhoods from across our city in partnership with almost 20 organizations an opportunity to learn more about these schools, to learn more about the admissions process, and to invite them into a conversation about what could be, and to really help to reimagine what was possible for us. And much of that work has gone into our ongoing advocacy and has really served to bolster our understanding of not just what is done across the country, but how we as a city can lead when it comes to really reimagining and redesigning what admissions can look like for students, and also what supports can look like in these schools to help ensure that students are successful. And so I'm really happy to be here, look forward to the conversation, look forward to the questions. Certainly, as our city looked at the most recent question as it relates to exam school admissions for the upcoming school year, all of that work, all of that really experience in our neighborhoods and across the city was brought to bear. And was deeply considered. And again, I heard some of the questions come up in the last panel, and I look forward to talking about kind of how we, in the most recent history, considered some of the options, why we coalesced around some and not others, and really what we're hoping is possible as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. I'm not sure who'd like to go next. Lauren, you were next on my list, so I'll go to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for those remarks, Tanisha. It is, as always, an honor and a privilege to work in partnership with you and with the NAACP. My name is Lauren Sampson. I'm a staff attorney at Lawyers for Civil Rights. We are a racial justice organization that has been working for a long time with community partners here, and very visible last night on exam school equity and the question of diversity in Boston's public education. I know that time is brief tonight, and I want to concentrate my remarks on a couple particular things, specifically data that LCR has obtained this year from the Boston Public Schools that I think highlight some of these issues that we're talking about. So I want to start with a data request that we received about admissions for this upcoming school year, so the 2020-21 school year. And that data revealed that despite changes by BPS to the exam school admissions process in 2019, including administering the ISEE during the school day for sixth graders, the percentage of Black students invited to enroll at BLS and BLA actually decreased from 2019 to 2020. For the 2020-21 academic year, only 8% of the students invited to enroll at BLS and 19% of those invited to enroll at BLA are Black. However, in the previous cycle, 10% of the students invited to enroll at BLS and 20% of those invited to enroll at BLA were Black. As Rasan Hall of the ACLU said last night, Black admissions at Boston Latin School are now at their lowest since desegregation. And this racial disparity is not for lack of applications. For the 2020 to 2021 academic year, Black and Latinx students made up 32 and 36% respectively of all applicants to the exam schools. White students constituted only 18% of all applicants. However, white students represent 48% of all invitees to BLS and 35% of all invitees to BLA. We know too that certain neighborhoods are overrepresented, particularly in invitations to Boston Latin School. For example, only 6% of all exam school applicants reside in West Roxbury, a community that has only 7,115 children under the age of 18. However, 17% of all students invited to Boston Latin School live just in West Roxbury. 20% of all BLS invitees reside in Rosendale, Jamaica Plain, or South Boston, even though those communities together made up only 13% of all exam school applications. By contrast, only 17% of BLS invitees come from Dorchester, the city's largest and more diverse neighborhood that's home to over 28,000 children, even though 33% of all applications were submitted from Dorchester. These disparities were with us before the pandemic, and they will be with us after. We should also know that these discrepancies begin well before students embark on the application process. White students made up nearly a quarter of all students in the Exam School Initiative in 2019, a program that was managed by BPS to increase diversity in the 3 exam schools, even though white students constituted only 14.9% of BPS students in 2019 to 2020. By contrast, Black and Latinx children, who represent 30% and 42.4% of all BPS students respectively, made up only 22 and 34% of that year's Exam School Initiative class. The pandemic has, of course, forced us to acknowledge that children attending different schools within BPS have very different educational experiences. We now have an opportunity to consider something different. I note, for example, that the recent revelation that a database error had excluded qualified students from BPS and had admitted students who, by BPS's own formula, should not have received an invitation, posed significant questions about whether or not the BPS admissions process was arbitrary and disconnected from student success. BPS certainly has no evidence to suggest that those students who were wrongfully admitted struggled at their respective schools, or that the overall quality of the schools has suffered. Finally, I want to note that LCR submitted a public records request to try and get information about NWEA and the assessment standards. We have posted all of these documents on our website, and we encourage the public to look through them. I want to draw attention to one in particular, the committee comparative evaluations that look at the different proposals that were submitted and consider them. There are a number of concerns raised with regard to NWEA, in particular, considering whether or not the test is most advantageous for the actual purpose for which it's being used. Keeping in mind concerns about the dual purpose of the test for the district, the lack of a paper-based test option, and the fact that MAP growth can't be the sole measure, such that BPS may continue to need to use grades, which, as we've demonstrated in multiple reports over the year, are not exactly measured evenly between the various kinds of schools that children attend before coming to the exam schools. We are very excited about the possibility for conversation here, and we want to stress that any conversation must begin with the premise that the exam schools must be reflective of the diversity of this district. I look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And then we have Ruby. Ruby's with us this evening. It was a long night and a long day, Ruby. Sorry about that. Happy to have you. And last but not least for this panel, Ruby Reyes. Welcome, Ruby.
Thank you. And thank you again for organizing this hearing. And thank you for my fellow panelists and the panelists that went before. My name is Ruby Reyes. I'm the director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance. We are an advocacy group that brings parents, students, and teachers together. BEJA supported and continues to support the recommendations of both exam school working group recommendations to forego this year's exam passed last night at the school committee meeting. BEJA also supports a phase-out approach to the exam school model and asks that all high-state testing be done away with, including the MCAS. The MCAS currently impacts hundreds of thousands of students across Massachusetts, which creates a culture of prioritizing testing rather than learning. The reason I share this is because as we think about the impact of high stakes testing like the MCAS and exam school testing, these exams create an insidious competitive school culture and scarcity of resources. The impact of this is most evident in the distribution of resources in school budgets. Every year, Beja comes to you as a city council to ask for your support in pushing the mayor to create a BPS budget that accurately reflects inflation and the needs of our students' families and aging buildings. In last year's budget, we saw a larger than 2% usual increase that still left school communities with gaps. The reality is this competition and scarcity culture in budget funding makes it so that all students and all school communities do not get what they need. The process identifies schools as different levels based on their MCAS scores, which further perpetuates school funding cuts, and schools are labeled as good or bad. This directly impacts enrollment and then school budgets. School communities then get labeled as failing or as a feeder school for the exam schools. Beja supports creating equitable schools and resources for all students to experience a high quality education. The reality is that the current process does not address multifaceted learning. A student can have special needs, areas of growth, and areas where they excel, but this process does not recognize and build on a student's skills, strengths, and assets. The process needs to shift to create multifaceted learning ecosystems within each school. So if a student needs additional support in a particular area, they can receive it. In addition, if a child is in need of more advanced work, they should also be receiving more challenging work in that particular area. When young people are not challenged or struggle, they become frustrated and act out, which often leads to increased disciplining rather than addressing the need for this type of multifaceted teaching, learning, and schools. According to the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the 3 exam schools educate approximately 5,800 students, or 11% of BPS. They have 44 English language learner students, which represents 0.2% of ELL students, and 199 special ed students, or 1% of BPS's special ed students. This statistics underscores another layer of exam school inequity in that ELL and special ed students are systematically excluded from the 3 exam schools. I would be remiss if I did not share that the focus of last night's vote pivoted away from the current dire pandemic situation that the 99.8% of ELL students and the 99% of special ed students in BPS, many of whom have not received in-person services for the past 8 months, are being ignored in an effort to prioritize the decision that impacts only 11% of BPS students, 0.2% of ELL, and 1% of special ed students. Close to 2,000 families are still waiting for their children to have special ed assessments, even scheduled. Currently, the greatest need in BPS is developing a comprehensive, operationalized plan that prioritizes in-person services for high-need students. We need to create multifaceted ecosystems of education that create high-quality education for all students. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. And of course, thank you to the rest of the panelists. Councillor Sabi George had to take a break, and as vice chair, I wanted to take over for her. I'm going to Councillor Mejia before Councillor Arroyo. So Councillor Mejia, you have the floor, and then Councillor Arroyo is next.
Thank you, because we're all trying to make accommodations to fit this schedule, this thing in here, just because. But I'm happy to see my people up in the space, as always, out here doing the work, fighting for our people. So I'm loving everything that you're saying, and I endorse every single word that came out of all 3 of y'all, okay? So I'm here for all of it. But I do have a very specific question for Ruby. When you talk about phase out model of the exam, what does that look like, and how long would it take?
I think it's about first starting with equity in school budgets. We know that currently some schools have more than others, and we know that there are systematic needs that are not being addressed in each and every school. And so what a phase out would look like would include a real investment in our public education system that that has been largely built on over 20 years of insufficient increases in funding, not just at the state level, but at the city level. So usually our mayor increases the school budget by 2%, which doesn't even meet inflation costs, in part because there has been an inadequate school funding formula at the state level, which has stolen, which has diminished, which has created an opportunity gap and an opportunity debt for public schools across the state. And so we fought for that legislation. It passed last year unanimously, the Student Opportunity Act, but it is currently also not being fully funded in this year's state budget. And so that gap falls on Boston to fill that gap. And so, you know, as we see school budget cuts, the schools that are receiving the largest amount of cuts are usually where there is also large amounts of gentrification, such as East Boston. And so in order to have a phase out approach, you have to have adequate funding for all of our schools so that our students, especially those in areas with the highest needs where they are having the most school budget cuts, are able to get what they need and able to create these types of multifaceted learning systems, not just when you are struggling and have an area of growth, but also to create challenging work for students that are excelling in different areas.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ruby. I got a text message from my friend Tanisha who wants to answer that question. You are more than welcome to. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you. I want to build on what Ms. Reyes just shared, because a piece of this certainly is budget, but I think one of the critical pieces to all of this is really, in many respects, driving down demand. And you drive down demand by really focusing on improved quality within the district writ large. Some of the data that was resurfaced, because I want to call out that so many advocates, I mean, you know, Beige has been on this, LCR has been on this for years. You know, we've been like banging at the door, hello, we've got a problem. But some of the data that was resurfaced through this most recent process really does point to significant deficiency as it relates to our K0 to K4, K5 education. We must really, with great intentionality, focus on that. Additionally, I want to call out that for the last 6 years or so, we've talked about 5 to 6 years, we've talked about high school redesign. That came up again last night. Two very critical kind of bookends to this that deserve equal, if not more attention than what we've seen poured into this discussion as it relates to exam school admissions. Yeah. If we are able to provide options for families across the city that speak to high quality public education, regardless of where you go to school, then the question becomes, okay, you know, why then, you know, to Ruby's point, it won't matter if you're at BLS, BLA, or the O'Brien. Your family can be just as happy at Charlestown High or the Burke or Fenway, which is amazing schools, Mission, amazing schools. So we really do need to focus on the K0 to K4, 5, absolutely, and get back to the business of high school redesign.
Yep, and I appreciate that comment. Having been traumatized by working in the education space for a few years, I learned a lot about the educational inequities that continue to persist way before I even came onto the scene. And I think to Lauren's point, in terms of just even looking at the racial breakdown, in terms of what are Black and Brown students, where they're ending up, a lot of them, O'Brien has a high percentage of Black and Brown students in comparison to Boston Latin. So when you want to talk about opportunity hoarding and you want to talk about who is getting where, there's a lot more to this exam conversation that we need to unpack. And that's going to take another 3 other hearings. But let me just tell you this, and I'll say this, what I said when I keep saying it before, is that we keep having the wrong conversation in every space that we happen to be in. And then we talk about where's the political will to address K through 8. But where has that political will been? We have been out here having the conversation, but our political leaders have not wanted to lean in. And I think if we're really serious about moving the needle, I think that the exam school has created an opportunity, because now we know the real issue here is that they don't want us, and they continue to try to lock us out of what I'm calling their schools. And I just want to put that out there again, just in case, for the record, that there's a lot of work to do and a lot of restorative and racial justice that needs to happen here in the city of Boston. But I will give the rest of my time to my counselor colleague Ricardo Arroyo, and thank you all for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And so I just want to be upfront with y'all. Some of y'all may have not seen my opening. And first and foremost, thank you everybody for being here, especially since so many of you were integral to what happened last night, which is momentous and historic and a step, I believe, in the right direction for equity. And so round of applause for all of y'all on that. But I just want to be clear about where I'm at. I know that we paused the exam for this year. I don't think we should have an exam point blank, period. That's where I'm at. That's been my stance. And so from that standpoint, I just have a couple questions. They're yes or no-ish questions. Is anybody on this panel aware of an exam that exists where those lower on the socioeconomic spectrum perform better or equally to those higher on the socioeconomic spectrum? Does an exam exist that does that?
So it's not going to be yes or no. My apologies, Councilor Arroyo.
Doesn't
What I would suggest is last night we received testimony from Dr. Ibram Kendi, exquisite testimony in which he really did give us a master class in standardized tests and their origins and their nature in being really the fruit of structural and systemic racism. And so I would offer to put that into the record. I can forward it to you so that it can be into the record for this particular hearing. But it really does open up the conversation about, if we want to have a district that is advancing anti-racist policies, should we embrace really a structural lever, a tool that has been well researched and well documented as supporting institutionalized racism. So to answer your question, I'm not aware of any standardized assessment that is not infused with cultural bias.
And that includes the NWEA, correct?
The research would suggest that all of these tests have some form of bias.
And just for folks who weren't in attendance, I know we have folks listening and watching who were not in attendance yesterday. The letter that Ms. Sullivan is referencing by Ibram Kendi was a masterclass. Certainly is worth entering into the record, and I will move to do that. But also is, just for folks who may not know this, the foundation of standardized testing comes from eugenics, which was in and of itself white supremacy and institutionally racist. And so as we sit here in the year 2020 of our Lord, and we talk about how we want to create more equitable schools, I have a difficult time, me just personally, understanding an argument that says, we know this was a tool created to advance white supremacy. We know that it is a tool that in practice creates institutional racism and systemic racism, that it excludes people of color and people from lower economic opportunities. And Ibram Kendi touched on this, from opportunity. And it does so legally in a way in which if we did it just to do it, people would look at this and say, this is wild, we can't do this. But you use a standardized exam created by eugenics, created to further this, that actually does this kind of work. And all of a sudden it's a metric of, whether or not you can handle rigor, whether or not you're educationally on par to enter into these exam schools. And so it sounds to me, and this is where I'm coming from, it sounds to me like the most equitable thing we can do for our system moving forward is create an entrance or a selection process that does not include standardized testing. Is that a statement that any of you would disagree with, that if we wanted to create an equitable system moving forward, it would eliminate standardized testing from the admissions process?
I just want to respond, and I agree with that statement, but at the same time, I just kind of want to pull back and just talk a little bit about the culture of high stakes testing that permeates throughout the district, not just in the exam schools, but also using the MCAS. And so you have 2 high stakes tests that determine whether or not you get a high school diploma from the Boston Public Schools and determine what type of diploma you get from the Boston Public Schools. And you have an entire system that creates levels for schools based on your MCAS scores. So you're labeled as failing or feeder based on not just the exam schools, but also on the MCAS. So you have teachers who then are required to teach the test. You have lesson plans that are purchased for these exams. You have a whole entire system that's based on testing rather than multifaceted learning and creative learning and meeting the needs of children where they're at. And so you can have a child that has special needs, but is also incredibly gifted in certain areas. We know from statistics that that child will not make it into an exam school because they don't really let in that many special ed students, right? But at the same time, this child needs challenging work in these gifted areas, but also needs support in these areas where they have special needs. And so meeting the needs of children is in part not just addressing exam schools or tools, but really thinking about how culturally Boston Public Schools is based on these types of exams that are high stakes and don't necessarily create a culture of learning.
I agree wholeheartedly. And so just in terms of focusing it on what the hearing is about in terms of entrance exams into how we do these whole policies, it sounds like I don't have anyone on this panel who would advocate for including high stakes examinations as part of our entrance examination policy as it is currently created, where it's 50-50, 50% GPA, with the exception of this year, 50% exam. Is that true that standardized exams, we understand, create racial inequity or a tool of racial inequity and should not be a part of trying to create a more racially inclusive system? Is that accurate? Can I just, before I move on to the next question?
Counselor with 2 L's and also with counselor, attorney Arroyo, as we testify. Listen, this is how I'll respond to the question, because you're asking a yes or no. You're looking for a binary answer, and I don't believe that there is truly one. This is how I'll answer the question. I agree with Ruby in her testimony, where she said, from really the goal, the aspiration should be to design a system where selective schools are just non-existent. All schools provide the same level of rigor that is now seen as the model. So that is the aspiration. And if that's the aspiration, then yes, it would mean that there are not assessments used for admissions into schools. Living in 2020, I think it's important to call out, and Lauren can comment on this as well. I mean, we have in the past 3-4 years, again, with community input from around this city, put forth a number of recommendations that range from not using a standardized test. And I heard you call it out earlier, using a model similar to Texas. We've proposed models similar to Chicago. We've proposed, at a minimum, having a test that is aligned with the BPS curriculum. If you're going to have an assessment, on the stuff that our kids are learning, right? There are many options for getting to for me, yes, is the ultimate goal of having, a system where all schools truly are equal. But on the road there, I think that there are different I think that there are different paths we can take to get to that end game.
And so I'll just ask the question in the first round to try and get into this, and I'll let you respond because I saw that you wanted to respond. But this will be my final question, so you can think about it as you respond to that. I think we're in agreement that there has to be an algorithm that we create to do this that creates an equitable outcome. And I think the point that I'm making is that examinations have no place in equity because they're not rooted in that. They don't come from that, and that's not what they do. They actually perpetuate inequity. And so when we're talking about what those algorithms are, there's many models for this. I like the University of Texas one, but I haven't seen exactly how that would play out in all kinds of different ways. And so there's a lot of things to this. With all due respect, I know, Ms. Sullivan, you just did a lot of work on this in the last 6 weeks. And so I consider you more of an expert on this and crunching data and doing those numbers. And so the question I have for you is, moving forward, what are the ideal algorithms, if not in terms of what we believe it should look like, but in what we believe it should create? What is the result that an ideal one should create? And that's it. And then I'm happy to give up the floor. And I think, Lauren, it was you who was going to speak up, and I'm sorry that I cut you off. So please do finish your statement. But that's it for me on this round. Just what is the best way? What are we looking to create with an algorithm, and what ways might we get there? Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Before I turn it back over to Tanisha, who, as you pointed out, is more versed, I think, than most of us on this particular topic, I want to stress that, as Tanisha said, we held a number of community meetings over the past few years. And if not a single parent had brought up the possibility of retaining a test, that wouldn't have been part of the recommendations we inevitably put forth. But they did. Several parents, several community members said we would be happy with the test if the test were tailored to BPS standards. And so our position was to put forward what the community thought could be possible, to include them in that process, and to be clear to the school committee and to the mayor that just because we call them exam schools does not mean they need to be exam schools, that you can do selective admissions or not have selective admissions, but that there is nothing necessary about the ISEE or the particular mechanism utilized at the time. Speaking for myself, I am purely an attorney and not a policymaker. I don't see my role to tell BPS what precisely is the correct mechanism to use. I see that I have two roles. One is to do what we did in those community forums, which is make the people who have a stake in this process have a voice in this process, allow them to speak up when it comes to how exactly their children are being evaluated and what opportunities they're being given. And the second is to make sure that the city is acting in conformance with its legal and constitutional obligations. And as I see it, the outputs at some of the exam schools do not conform. And so we have put forward proposals that are consonant with Supreme Court precedent, with guidance from the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. And it is not for us to pick between them. It is for the people of Boston, the parents of Boston, to come together and pick something that works best for everyone. Of course, if I were to purely consider this on a personal level, I am Canadian. I did not take a standardized test until I took the LSAT. That was the first standardized test I ever took. But I believe that our role in our capacity as civil rights attorneys is to empower the communities that have been left out of this process. And so to ask that if we look to a model for after this pandemic, that we consider non-exam based models, because it doesn't have to be this way. And certainly jurisdictions around the country have demonstrated that.
Thank you so much. If anybody else wants to answer the algorithm question, that's fine, but I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. I apologize for my brief absence, and I am back and with you for the duration of the evening. I know Councilor Mejia went, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor Wu. Any questions for this panel this evening?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for everything that you are doing, have done so much right now. I want to push a little bit further on Councilor Arroyo's line in terms of trying to connect to the idea of what it would take to get to that ultimate place, sooner than later, of not having to think about what is the most least inequitable or fairest way of gatekeeping, because there is not a need to have a Hunger Games situation across the district, and there are that every school is equipped with opportunities, supports, and pathways for supporting every type of learning. How do, as you've been thinking about this particular model that we have now and the changes that are now adopted and going to be implemented and the potential for what this means after the pandemic, what is the kind of medium term step right after the results or data or whatever metrics are taken from this next year and this class of exam school students? How do we get to the point where we are not so much talking about selective enrollment criteria at all?
So I think one possibility, and I alluded to this in my initial testimony, is that we already have students at the exam schools who did not meet the criteria that BPS identified and were still admitted, and by all accounts did not fail and did not lower the quality of the school. And so I think after a year in which we employ this new mechanism, it's an opportunity for the district to take stock and say, what happened? Did we feel like the quality of the schools diminished? Did we get fewer applications? My guess is that will not happen. That institutions that are in many cases older than the United States will not all of a sudden lose their luster because we used a different mechanism for 1 year during a global pandemic. And I think that idea, what is actually the most accurate predictor of student success, is one of the great opportunities I see in this experiment over the next year. Is what are we using to look at how students succeed or fail? What supports are needed? I think to Ruby's point, what are we doing to make sure that students with special needs are being supported in these environments, that English language learners are being supported in these environments? I think taking this opportunity to see what actually is a good predictor of student success, since we know it doesn't necessarily mean grades in the ISEE, is an opportunity that we should seize on this year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, there are many questions that we should take the opportunity to explore over the next 3 to 6 months as a community. And one of them, perhaps even chief among them, is, in my opinion, what is the role of the selective school within the Boston Public Schools? What is it? Why is it there? Why are they there? Why do they exist? Why do they really kind of rise up in us such an emotional response when we start to talk about, making modifications? What's that? What is that? Because I think what we might find is that it's as much about the school and the academics as it is about culture. And we talk a lot about the culture within the building, but I think the exam schools, the selective admission schools, in many respects speaks to the culture in this city and the things that we value, the traditions that we hold dear, the things that we believe we need to protect. And so I think that there is, for us as a city, an opportunity to do some self-reflection using really these schools as a centerpiece. Because when there was a defining moment on our working group when we really pulled back and asked this question around, okay, what is the standardized test about? Why do we feel like we need it? What information is it giving to us? And once we were able to, as a group, really explore that central question and come to consensus about, okay, we want to know that children are at grade level. Okay, whether you agree if that's the right answer or not, okay, consensus is that's what we want to know. Then are there other ways that we can get there other than a standardized test? And so I think to answer your question, Counselor Wu, if the North Star is to have, all of our schools on equal footing to the point where, this idea of a selective admission school is really non-existent, then I think we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions that go beyond academic standards and really speak to our culture and our values as a city.
Okay, I want to I'll just ask one more that's a little bit more of a technical question following the last panel's presentation, in which they were looking at different models in the very, very short term around neighborhood-based or school-based, and they, pushed the, or had a really beautiful representation of the Chicago model around socioeconomic status by census tracts, et cetera. As we're thinking about what, again, in this immediate term to get us to that, hopefully not long-term, but big picture vision, how do we think about what to measure this year in particular to evaluate what the immediate post-pandemic changes should be to still keep moving in that direction? Whether it is, do you see the Chicago model as something that is in that direction? Was it something that was chosen as an alternative or sort of dismissed as an alternative to this current proposal that's been adopted? Are there other models that you think would be another step in that direction, if not, a sort of wholesale either or?
I think one thing we have asked for multiple times is for the district itself to do some of these studies. The district has access to data that no one else truly does. Access to data, access to students, access to teachers, and has continually declined to even study the issue. There have been working groups convened. We have had multiple of these hearings, and the thing that we have not seen from the district is a wholesale good faith analysis of what the possible alternate models of admission are and what their impact and effect would be and how workable they are. We are talking in these abstract terms because BPS has not done that work. For example, we have talked about, for example, like a neighborhood model. And in some of our sessions with parents and families, folks raise the question of, well, what does it mean if my neighborhood has seen a lot of school closures or if there's been a lot of gentrification? What is the impact of that on how we do like a top X% model? Those are great questions, and it makes sense to study them in a Boston specific context. And it makes sense for the district that has the most information about school closures, about school demographics, about teacher needs, about marking, about everything, to do that work. And we are certainly here as partners and allies. As Tanisha said, we have produced our own reports, but we cannot replicate what the district can do in terms of conducting that research. And this is an opportunity. This year, as we've said over and over again, is an opportunity to do that work and to say, if we were to employ this model, what would that look like? What would that mean in the city, given the segregation of our neighborhoods, given the patterns of how students are going to school, given what we now know about racial inequity exposed by the coronavirus? I think that is a very important precursor to it establishing what any inputs would be for any model we go further with.
Yeah, I want to build on that. And I appreciate Lauren, you kind of bringing the historical perspective into the space. I want to be clear that prior to this year's working group, there were at least 2 prior attempts at working groups within the district. And in each of those instances, they were not allowed to move forward. And in the moment, we knew what that was about. It was protectionist. It was an attempt to shut down conversation, to prevent progress. And the historic pattern of the district and the city has been one of protection of the status quo when it comes to these schools. That said, I can say that what I've seen in the last 8 weeks on this topic is nearly a 180. From the perspective of the working group, it seems as if, for whatever reason, there is now a realization and an realization that we need to have these conversations and an openness to have them, and a willingness to do something different. And I do want to call out that is not what we've seen. To Lauren's point, it has been, we've got to file a FOIA to get any information. That has not been the last 8 weeks. So it's my hope that continues going forward. Now, to the question about different models, I think it's important to understand the Boston public school, the city of Boston context, and understand that, and I think so, it may have been mentioned on the last panel as well, that our district is unique because our students have so many options in terms of where they go to school. Private schools, parochial schools, Metco, charter, BPS, homeschool, like it runs the gamut. And so when we think about a model across anywhere in the country that we can kind of adopt, there's no other city like our city on this particular issue. And so what we have found from a policy standpoint in looking at these issues, at this particular issue, is an opportunity to really create from the best, some of the best of what we're seeing in other parts of the country. So to that point, the Texas model is one that personally, I like that model. I do believe that there's a way that we could do it. I do believe that there's an opportunity to, again, let me say this is in the current context, current framework, exam schools or selective schools exist. Okay, that's the box I'm talking in. Okay,
Yeah.
I do think there's an opportunity to think about how the top 10% or 15% of students from any school. It doesn't have to be a BPS school. If you apply to one of these schools and you are ranked within the top 10% of your sending school, and you live in the city of Boston, I think it's worth exploring how what that might look like for our students. I think, so that 10% piece from U Texas, I like it a lot. I also love the SES factor in Chicago, and really appreciate how they use SES tiers, which I will note is different than what ultimately came as the recommendation, the consensus recommendation from the working group. I think that's absolutely, there's an opportunity to explore that even more. There is also in other parts of the country where other districts use in lieu of a standard, an additional standardized test, they use what would be akin to our MCAS, the test that children are already taking, right? So what I do think there's an opportunity again, for us here in Boston to create something that's different, but take some of the best of what we've seen across the country. And that really is what the working group did in this instance, really kind of took different elements of different models to create something that is uniquely Boston. I do look forward to what a 2.0 might be. And with specific focus, personally, I really want to go back to the board as it relates to using geocode to really zero in on socioeconomic status to address what we know full well are glaring racial wealth gaps within neighborhoods. So yeah, I mean, net, there's no model that we would be able to just, we could, but that's not what we do, right? We will need to continue to co-design this going forward.
Madam Chair, do I have time for one more, or am I way over my time?
You do have time for one more. I'm happy with that, but we do have another panel.
Okay, I'll go quick, and it's just a short thing. I'd love to hear from each panelist. So over this next year, which will be tremendously important as we're thinking about this as a turning point, what is the one thing that the city / district / policy makers should just be holding on to, either as a thing to measure or a sort of consideration to be putting alongside this policy?
I guess my reflections from last night were just how saddening it was to see just like the extreme racism shared, I think, in testimony. And so I think Boston, I'm a Texas native. I'm a graduate of the Texas public schools. but just, I think being profoundly and sadly impacted by everyone's testimony from different neighborhoods, good and bad, but just the levels of racism was just really saddening. I've lived in Boston for over 20 years, so it's not a surprise, but it's really hard to hear, I think, over and over again. And just, it was also fascinating to see the way that white supremacy was just used in such a slick way. All the things that we have been fighting for and advocating for around equitable school budgets, asking for transparency, asking for language translation, asking for, communities to have input in their school budgets in these ways that directly impact what they get and what they don't get, I think was utilized for the sake of talking, promoting white supremacy.
I think I know you said one, I do have two. The first, building off of what Ruby said, is transparency. To Tanisha's point, I can't tell you the number of hours of my life I have spent emailing to try to extract public records from the Boston Public Schools for data, for records that do exist and should be made available to everyone without having to engage a lawyer to extract those documents. If the Boston Public Schools is sincere in its commitment to engaging people in this process, it should make that possible to do. I think the second thing I want the district, I want the council, I want everyone to remember over the course of this year is that school segregation is deeply tied to residential segregation. And that residential segregation did not happen by accident. It was an intent, and it was a force, and it was an object of municipal, state, and federal governments. LCR just filed a lawsuit against HUD over its attempt to roll back the disparate impact protections of the Fair Housing Act. And so I've spent a lot of time over the past couple months with that data, with that case law, with that information. And we continue to hear in our conversations with BPS about how, the segregation is just a feature of that. People are just sorted that way, and that's where people live. And those excuses were not acceptable in the 70s. They are not acceptable now. And in any proposal that engages with where children go to school, we have to engage with the very pervasive role that governments played in sorting people and giving them access to opportunity in a very racialized way.
Agree. Going forward, I will say over the next 3 to 10 months, I'll say, on this particular issue, what I will be actively monitoring first and foremost is implementation. And really with laser-like focus, making sure, doing our part to make sure that the implementation of this policy is really one that is robust and executed with fidelity. Because, for as much as we've talked and debated about the policy and, kind of the technical levers of it, at the center of this are children who are going to, in September, prayerfully walk into buildings, but we'll see. But who are going to, be going into buildings, having this experience as their backdrop. And so getting that implementation right is our duty as a collective. The second piece connected to that is supports. The working group spoke specifically to students who may, for a myriad of reasons, need additional supports. Personally, I believe that all of the children who are going into these school buildings, again, hopefully, by September of next year, will all need supports. I mean, the social and Counselor Sabi George, I know that this is one of your primary issues, like the socio-emotional supports for our children. They were well needed before this pandemic. They're going to be critical come this upcoming year. So just really looking at what supports the district intends to put in place specifically for children who will be entering these schools next year. And then the last piece I'll say is engagement. there is undoubtedly a need for the district to do better as it relates to engaging families. And as Ruby said, we've been talking this for I don't know how long. Okay, those of us who sit in these meetings and have sat in these meetings, we have clamored on this issue for years. And the rest of the city got to see what we fight up against all the time, nearly all the time. We must do better. There is no excuse for the lack of translation, quality translation available in this. No excuse. There's no excuse for, not being able to provide adequate notice, timely notice. Okay. And I understand and deeply appreciate the work of the district. I know folks are working double, triple overtime. I get it. But the engagement piece going forward on this issue is, again, another critical lever, because our city, and I spoke to this last night, this is such a fragile issue for many reasons. And if we don't get this right on implementation, supports, and engagement, it could leave a very negative, indelible mark on us for years to come. So those are the three things I'm going to be on top of.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Wu. I think that was a great question to wrap up this panel on. I will just add the one thing. I think, Tanisha, what you just said, especially about the implementation, it's got to be top of the list to make sure that we, what was agreed upon last night is done well and done right. And that, because it is, again, it's the kids in the middle of it. And I think to Lauren's point around some of the challenges around accessing information and data, that modeling any of these models is really important, because Boston is such a different city, because we've got all of these sort of nuanced systems that, anyone pulling that one lever, the chain reaction along it can be quite impactful, and it can be quite negative if we don't do it right. So modeling any proposal is very much important. So I want to thank the three of you for joining us for this panel. We do have one more panel. It's a fairly large panel. So as they come in, Lauren, Tanisha, Ruby, you're welcome to stay.
Thank you.
Or also sign off, which is more than fine with me and the lead sponsors and those of us that remain in this hearing today. So thank you all for being here. And just get back to my notes. So I'm appropriately welcoming our next panel. And then following this panel, we will go to public testimony. So this panel 4, we have Lisa Green, who's a BLS parent and co-chair of the BLS School Parent Council, as well as a member of the Boston Coalition for Educational Equity. Christine Duffy Erickson is a BLA parent and member of Quest, Quality Education for Every Student. Katie Roberts, BLS parent, co-chair of Families for Equity and Diversity at BLS. And Denise Wilson, I think it's Jutras, BLS parent, co-chair of Family for Equity and Diversity at BLS. If I mispronounce names, please correct me. And I look forward to testimony. I think Lisa was first on my list. So unless you've predetermined a different order, we'll go with Lisa.
Hi, welcome. My name's Lisa Green. I'm here today representing the Boston Coalition for Education Equity. I'm from the North End, and I'm also a parent of 2 children at Boston Latin School, where I'm co-chair of the Parent Council for the past couple of years. BCEE applauds the historic step that the school committee took yesterday in creating a 1-year admissions process that recognizes that students do not compete on a level playing field when they vie for seats in Boston's selective high schools. Last night was an important first step, but the hard work of creating a permanent system that's more equitable and making long-term anti-racist changes lies ahead of us. This week's flood of voices speaking out for change gives us hope that we can enter into a fair and productive citywide conversation to build a better system. It's encouraging to see so much support among the public, the school committee, and as we saw on our 2019 City Council election questionnaire, the majority of council members also see the problem and want long-term change. When my daughter started at BLS in 2016, I was concerned about the series of racist events that had just happened. So I joined the school's equity team. At that point, it was headed by Mr. Howland and Mr. Contempostas, and it's now headed by Ms. Starrett. Until I started seeing the exam school admissions data that team reviews every year, I thought my experience was much like everybody else's. Like many parents in my neighborhood, I heard about the exam school admissions process in the sandbox at the park when my daughter was still in diapers. Like everyone I knew, I learned the ropes. We prepped our kids for the test and took whatever steps we could to increase their chances of getting in. That takes time, effort, money, and knowledge of the admission system that the majority of families in Boston simply don't have. And it's a large part of why BLS looks the way it does. And as Ms. Nagasawa shared, the lack of diversity at BLS doesn't just hurt the kids who don't get in, it also hurts the kids who do, whether they're Black, Latinx, Asian, or white. The data that I saw at those equity team meetings hit me like a ton of bricks that first year, as it has every year since. That's why I first got connected with Tanisha, Lauren, and the coalition that's been looking at the exam school admissions process for years, which in turn was a large part of why we formed the Boston Coalition for Education Equity, a group of 12 education, civil rights, and political advocacy organizations working to restore an elected school committee to Boston. Over the course of this work, I've come to learn that my experience is far from typical. In Boston as elsewhere, some students live in families like mine with the time and resources to successfully navigate the admissions process. Others have to put all their energy into not getting evicted. Thousands are homeless. In proposing that 80% of seats be allocated by ranking students within zip codes, the working group tried to have students compete with others who have similar life circumstances. There are certainly differences within zip codes, but not as vast as the divide between rich and poor across the city. The current pandemic has expanded these gaps, but it did not create them. When life finally returns to normal, Boston will still be a city divided, where some children have many more of the opportunities that contribute to school success than others. So we must all begin working together now to develop a permanent and more equitable admissions process for these 3 schools. We agree with what Dr. Kendi said last night. This proposal can begin the process of Boston transforming our high-quality exam schools into high-quality opportunity schools. Let's call them that. Let's make them opportunity schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, very much. Next, I'd love to hear from Christine and then Katie.
Hi, my name is Christine Duffy Erickson. I'm a parent to a sophomore at BLA and to 2 5th graders. And I'm also a member of Quest, Quality Education for Every Student. Quest supports the measures approved late last night and in response to COVID, but we also support the continued wider moves toward equity beyond this crisis that we're talking about now, addressing the long-standing admissions inequities and the uneven quality of schools across the district and the ways our children are assigned to those schools across the district. The issues and research of the working group are not new, we all know that, but COVID has exposed the cracks in the system, and many parents, as Lisa mentioned, who have been through the exam process are recognizing the inequities and finally addressing long-standing questions, the troubling questions of merit and grade inflation, access to exams. And we're also recognizing the effects of admissions largely on a test. Not every parent can or should have to invest money in test prep. We've seen hours of preparation that many of our peers, our kids' peers, can't spare, and some were not invited because they simply had been tracked out of classes years before. And you know, the informal networks that Lisa talked about were certainly in my experience as well. So some parents were in the know and others were not. These, many of these disparities exist whether the test is the ISEE, the NWEA, or the MCAS. And of course, there are risks to gaming and test prep that have existed for so long. In addition to my sophomore, I have 2 10-year-olds, one of whom has experienced testing through getting into AWC and one who did not. We know that test scores are not the final word on their potential and skills. And for many children, that one test score can end the conversation and doesn't expand but limits their support opportunities and expectations. And that is one thing we would like to look past into the future and support changes in that area. My sophomore at BLA could see the disparities when she was choosing her schools and chose her school with that in mind. Of course, the brunt of the impact falls on Black and Latinx families, but my kids and all our kids are witnesses to the inequity in the system. I personally welcome a plan for next year that is more equitable for my fifth graders, is more equitable and accessible across the entire city, and one that, yes, may personally impact my own fifth graders' choices in Rosendale. But Quest believes that this one-year proposal serves only as a starting point. We're looking past the COVID crisis. We call on the City Council to support this new task force and its charge to creatively think about exam schools. We want to see a thorough analysis of this next admissions cycle and ongoing monitoring of any long-term changes put into place. We all must work towards a multi-factored, rich admissions policy that ensures access of opportunity to children of all backgrounds, but also impacts all the neighborhoods in the city of Boston. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Katie, welcome. Oh, unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you. And I apologize, I'm going back and forth between back to school night and this meeting, so I missed your introduction. But I'm honored to be here. So, I'm a parent at Boston Latin School and co-chair with Denise Wilson-Jutras of Families for Equity and Diversity, which works to help make the school more welcoming for all students. I also wanted to underline the statements made by a few of you and Ms. Starrett and others earlier that it's hugely important to focus on all the schools in Boston, not just the exam schools. So I just wanted to add that. My two white kids have been welcomed and loved in spaces in Boston where they were in the racial minority, at the Hurley K-8 school, which is more than 72% Hispanic, and at the preschool and after school and camp programs at United South End Settlements. The Black and Latinx children in these spaces deserve the same open arms in the white spaces that they must enter throughout the city every day, that many people in the city seem to think they're not truly worthy to enter all of these spaces. Boston Latin School has changed dramatically since my older child started the 7th grade back in 2013. And most of these positive changes have occurred under the great leadership of head of school, Rachel Starrett. But there is not yet a critical mass of Black or Latinx kids at the school such that these students can each fully benefit from the support we all need from peers with shared experiences. They should not have to be the only Black or Latinx kid in the room, which all too often happens. The admission system needs to change, and the approval of the proposal last night is a good first step. I was deeply moved by many words last night, including the powerful statement from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, read by Ms. Sullivan. Dr. Kendi notes that the so-called achievement gap is in fact an opportunity gap. And I will repeat the closing words of his statement that Lisa just quoted, in that we can now begin the process of Boston transforming our high-quality exam schools into high-quality opportunity schools. Families for Equity and Diversity at BLS will keep working to help make the school a better place for Black and Latinx students in particular, through events bringing people together, including an annual multicultural potluck dinner, discussions about videos and readings on race and equity, and taking actions such as testifying last night. Meanwhile, our city can and must work toward the vision where all children are seen as equally deserving of such opportunities, starting with a more equitable admissions system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Denise, welcome.
Thank you. I won't have my camera on, but thank you. I'd like to share a little bit. So my name's Denise Wilson-Jutras, and I'm a graduate from BLA. And I'm the parent of twins at Boston Latin School, and I'm the co-chair with Katie Roberts for Families for Equity and Diversity. FEQD, as we call it, seeks to promote equity, understanding, and active consideration of the diverse BLS community through education, advocacy, communication, activities to build deeper connections. I'm here because little things mean a lot. While most parents would have been excited and ecstatic to have their kids accepted to Boston Latin, the jury was still out when my kids got accepted. And you say, why? There's been a long history of how Black and brown children have been made to feel when they're not part of a community where they feel accepted. Any and every parent wants and needs to know that their children will be accepted and be made to feel welcome at their school. When I was considering sending my kids to Boston Latin School, we were invited to an open house. And there we met some people from the Black Alumni Association. And there we were made to feel welcome, like they were wanted, and they were going to do what was needed for them to succeed. And after that meeting, we scheduled a visit. So we scheduled 2 visits to see the school. After my children visited the school, there was concern that they saw. And they both went on 2 different days and they reported similar things. So me being me, of course, I had concerns. I reached out to the Black alumni who I had met at the open house. And I gave him my concerns, and what I found was that he reached out to Ms. Starrett, who had not yet moved to Boston at that time, and hold on, I'm nervous. Gave me and my children a call to discuss our concerns. I was impressed that she took the time to listen and address our concerns and decided to send my kids to Boston Latin. This is in direct contrast to my experience as a teenager growing up during the busing era. It's been noted. As I think about that, just the traumatic experience of going to an exam school, and it wasn't so much the school as it was, there were many friends I had that was very diverse, and I can't say it was a bad experience from that perspective. However, after school, participating in sports or events, I had to be driven to practice because it wasn't okay for me to be in South Boston. It wasn't okay for me to be in Savin Hill. Those experiences would make a parent like myself hesitate to send my kid to Boston Latin. However, due to the acceptance that I felt from people such as Martha Pierce, who I feel that she does an outstanding job reaching out to families, as well as my kids feeling connected at this point with the school. I feel those are integral parts of the change, as well as Ms. Starrett implementing so many new things that make, I think, Black and brown families consider, is this the right place for me? And some of those things being the equity team, which was formed after the incident at Black at BLS, and that used to be only once a month, and now it's twice a month. Katie referred to the multicultural potluck, which many people come out to that event, and it's a very welcoming experience as well. And for me, the responsiveness from leadership in reference to issues that might come up and need to be addressed, I feel like they're handled in a way where I don't feel like they're swept under the rug, that they're addressing them. And I appreciate the fact that there are people of color in leadership positions in the school. And the opportunity to have seats set aside where Black and brown people for the SSC and the SPC, which is the school site council and the school parent council, are all things that are important to me as a parent. And I think we have a long way to go. And as people alluded, I'm all for BPS being dismantled, and it needs to start from the bottom up to give us new opportunities for all children to succeed and not just some. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise, for your testimony. And I want to kick it off to, I think that was it, Councilor Arroyo, for any opening questions of this panel.
First and foremost, thank you all of you for your patience and for your testimony today, especially Ms. Wilson. I heard you say that you were nervous, and so I thank you for really facing that down and showing courage in your statements today. And so thank you so much for that. And so, you know, I think I might be preaching to the choir at this point with this panel. I've been very vocal on this one about how I feel about standardized examinations, period. I think that, you know, when we talk about creating more equitable policies, you can't do that with a tool that is used to create racial inequity that does that. You can't say we're going to use this tool that creates racial inequity that was created by racist eugenics to do this exact thing that it does, and then say we're going to incorporate that into our entrances. And I think, you know, I think at least 3 of you have spoken about what occurred yesterday in regards to the suspension of the exam for this year and sort of as a first step to what should come next. And I can't speak for all of you. I don't know if all of you were here for the entirety of this hearing. And what I'd like my first question to be, is there anything that wasn't addressed in the last 3 panels that you feel like should be addressed and you would like to address? And if there is something, the floor is any of y'all's to take on that. And I see Lisa's got her hand up, so.
That's a great question, Councilor Arroyo.
So, you know, I think it's been a rough week for everyone, right? And if I had to put one thing before the city council to remember from this process, I'd want you to remember the frustration, right, of the folks on the other side of this issue, right? They felt like they didn't have a voice. They sent emails and letters and had Zooms and called their city councilors, right? And I really feel that. I really feel sympathy for them because I've been there too, right? I've been on this side of issues where you go to the city council hearings, you feel like nobody's listening to you and you have no one to turn to. The parents of Boston need a voice in decision-making. We need an elected school committee. They're emailing you guys. You guys don't have the power to make the decision, but you know, we need somebody who does, right? It was a failure of engagement. And when that engagement failure happens, as it does in BPS, where can people turn? And so I'd plead with you to think about that because I've been to school committee meetings like that before, dozens of times before, right? Except it's Black and brown people. We marched to a city council meeting. I think there are counselors with us. I think Councilor Edwards was with us, and I forget who all else was at that meeting. I think Councilor Campbell. But hundreds of people marching in the street, and the same thing happened, right? The same thing happens every 2 weeks at school committee. And so if we want to have a voice, I think we need an elected school committee. So that's what I would throw in there. And I'll see.
That's certainly a lot of folks talking about that today. Anyone else on that question? Just something that you haven't seen addressed yet that you would like to address? I think Christine, I saw. Yep.
Yeah, I think couching engagement in terms of education for a bunch of parents who have not been around these issues for a very long time is really critical right now. I'm seeing that in my neighborhood and with people on my side of the issue and on the other side of the issue. They're coming in with a lack of information, whether willfully or not, that is affecting their view on the issue. And these are complicated issues. And the folks who have simplified those issues for me, I have been so grateful for. And it's not BPS who's doing that. It's other activists. And not every parent has access to those people. I wouldn't have had access to those people 2 years ago when I was new to this. And I'm really still new to it now. The people that I talk about these issues with have been doing this for many, many years. They know how a school council meeting works. They know how public comment works. They know what to expect in a meeting. They have seen the research that is so critical to this going forward. And it's compelling research, it's compelling information, and it's well-established information. And that to me makes it less scary to trust the working group and their process. And I feel like it's a missed opportunity if that information clearly does not, clear information doesn't get out to them. That's a long-winded way of saying education plus engagement is really key right now. And it's not something that BPS has traditionally been good at, or that we have a lot of trust. So it's building all of that back up again. I'll leave it there.
And I know Ms. Wilson doesn't have a camera, so.
Hi. Something that I think is having neighborhood meetings where parents are engaged in their schools. I've been in too many schools that for me are unacceptable in the neighborhoods. For instance, the cleanliness of schools and where kids are allowed to go, and that's acceptable, to me is not acceptable. And I think that leadership in school, they need to reach out to parents, because parents are busy and it's difficult. And I always approach things from the standpoint, don't tell me what you can't do, but tell me what you can do. I'm gonna have a meeting in April. I might lay it out, but for the year. So you can't come in September or October, but can you come in December or January? I think we have to be solution oriented and reach out to parents where they are. And one of the things that FEQD did was we started having meetings in our neighborhoods. We had one in Hyde Park. We had one in Mattapan. We were planning to have one in East Boston prior to COVID to reach out to families so that they could be heard. And I think that's something that's really missing from the people who need to hear. We need to find a way to get the information to them so that they can hear and they can be informed. So many people are not informed of what's happening. And I agree with Christine. If they don't know, how can they be engaged? People know how things work. And there's a need there. And I think that's something that's really important to. And I also think that BPS needs to really consider, you can't build on a foundation that's not really for people, not for everyone. I think we need to consider trying to redo, just demolishing what we have and figuring out something new that's all inclusive of all the children and the families in BPS.
Thank you so much to all of you. And I think what the common thread that I heard through all of that was we need better engagement, right, with parents and a better transparency and flow of information. And that kind of came up in a panel just before you about how BPS shares its data, right? So we're talking about internal, like deep dives in transparency, but also just surface level, this is what we're doing, transparency. And what I can tell you is to not cross the streams too much. But when we were talking about police civilian review boards, one of the things that New York said they did was they paid for a communications person. And the role of that communications person wasn't actually to interact with the press, but was to interact with the public. Because so often the public was left out of conversations about what was available to them. They had these resources they didn't know about. They had all these things we didn't know about. And I think the one thing that I am seeing, and it's probably old hat for many, is that we have folks on both sides of the spectrum saying the same thing. We have folks with access to resources, access to the ability to do these things, access to networks of power, who are saying, I have no idea what's going on. And then we have folks who have less access, less ability, who are dealing with the same issues. And so it's clearly just, there's something dysfunctional there. And it's not something that's made easier by the amount of money that you have or the amount of access you may have. And so I think that's something that I agree with all of you. We should dig into how we deal with that, because when we're doing things like this, there really should be more communication. And I think that was the one part of the suspension of this year's plans that I thought was problematic, was that we didn't have parents allowed to look into how this was being done and conducted in a way that I think would have made buy-in much easier. And so, that's on that. The only other question I have for you all is, you've told me what you didn't see spoken about, and I appreciate that. In terms of what you did see, in terms of conversations about how we move forward as a district, and where the focus really needs to be, actionable focus moving forward. where specifically in this next year, and COVID's doing a lot of things. We got a lot of different things going on. Kids aren't in person. We have all of these things. But in terms of this specific thing, as we look into how we make the suspension of what we did yesterday really work in this year for these children, what are the things that you believe we need to make sure we focus on to make sure that it works for them in this next year? And that's it. And anybody who feels inclined to answer may answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Feel inclined. I think they need to feel welcomed. I think that to me is number one. You have to have the students feel like they belong, that this is where I'm supposed to be. And I think that's the main thing. I think if you feel welcome, like you belong here, I think that will speak volumes, because that will allow a child who might be nervous. And I've observed for myself, students coming into the school and getting accepted, and they have a certain swagger about them. And then there's other students who come and they're like, am I supposed to be here? Is this the right place? That does a lot on someone's psyche. And I think that's what we really need to think of. And that's where I think people who are making comments, we all need to have grace, and we need to really think about outside of our own walls, how would you want to be treated? And let's move forward. These are children. And I just think of my experience, I still feel like I'm somewhat traumatized from my educational experience in Boston. And I went to 5 schools in Boston. So there's a lot to be said about that. And I think this is the time for this to stop. And we have the opportunity to do it now. So I think a welcome is big.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo, and thank you, Denise. Everyone, it's great to hear from everybody, but I'm sorry, I particularly favor Denise's comments. Councilor Mejia, questions for this panel?
Yeah, I know Councilor Wu was texting us. Do you want to go before me, Councilor Wu?
Thank you. I'll just say I didn't have any questions. Councilor Arroyo asked so many great ones. So thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. Thank you to this panel. I have to run in a little bit, so I just wanted to say I'm very, very grateful for your time.
Thank you. And before Councilor Mejia goes, it's a good time to remind participants that are waiting to public testify. We have 16 signed up for this evening. If you want to start raising your blue hands, we'll get you in the queue. Councilor Mejia?
Yes. So I think I'm going to need some therapy after all of this, because all of this has been so triggering and traumatizing. And I feel like I'm reliving an era that I never wanted to go back to, having grown up here in the city of Boston. And I keep talking about the busing era because this is reminding me of that moment in time where we were not wanted in any of these schools. And what happened was that parents took their little suitcases and left, which is what they call white flight. So in case you all don't know that, Google that little situation, because that happened here. And some of the things that I saw online were people threatening that was going to happen again, that if we got rid of the test, that everybody was going to pack up and leave. Like, it's so bad that little Black and brown children are going to start invading their schools. Like, that's the type of stuff that I was hearing from parents, okay? And as a parent of color who has a child in a Boston public school and who graduated from a Boston public school, I was appalled by the just the outpour of what I felt as though if we changed and got rid of the test, we were watering down their schools, or that the notion is that if more of our kids got in, then we would be taking away the prestigiousness of it, right? Like all of these things that made me feel some kind of way, right? And this is what I said earlier, is that I have to balance being a city councilor and my own feelings, but in reality, at the end of the day, I'm not gonna leave these two things separate, because being who I am is political in and itself. And I just can't not represent and speak my truth no matter where I happen to be in. And I know it makes some people feel uncomfortable, and I really do appreciate this opportunity to hear and to see that we have allies who are out here, who, and then hearing from parents who said, you know, I live in West Roxbury, or I live in Rosendale, and my child is in the 6th grade, but you know what? I'm gonna stand with equity because I know that's the right thing to do, right? And getting 500 and something, I don't know, maybe 600 emails. Thank you all for the advocacy of people who were standing in support of this test, gave me hope, right? And I think it's important for us to recognize that we're living now in a city that is caught between these two opposing views. Those who want to keep things the way that they used to be, and those who are willing to go hard to change what could be, right? And I see that in this space right now, in this conversation that we're having, that we're looking at parents who, even though you are white, you deeply care about our kids. And we didn't have that in the 70s. And that's why this moment in time presents itself as an opportunity for us to really bridge those differences and make this conversation about what is just and what is fair around racial equity, and having allies who are willing to push with us on that fight. So I just want to say thank you to you all for your work in that and moving this conversation forward. And to Denise, you and I are going to go to therapy together, okay? Because we were both traumatized in different ways as a result of this situation that is still yet to be unresolved here in the city of Boston. But I'm here for all of it. Trust that you have a partner in me. And I do believe a lot of the answers, questions that Ricardo, Councilor Arroyo asked were really definitely right on point. And I do agree that what we need to do is move towards an elected school board, a fully elected school board that's really representative of the people, because I believe that when we have people who we elect, then there's a level of accountability about the decisions and the votes that they're making. Right. And I think that we also have an opportunity, given the latest shenanigans that have occurred as of late, we have an opportunity to really look at all of these votes that have been made in the past and how those votes have really countered racial equity in the city of Boston. Because if you had someone who's the chair of the school committee that had no regard for people of color, imagine all of those votes that were made that were not in the best interest of Black and brown children. It's just a lot for us to unpack here. But my question, Lisa, this is for you, okay? So I really appreciate your personal testimony about how you came to learn about the real realities of the inequities in exam schools in Boston. And while it felt like everyone in the world at last night's meeting, a lot of parents are still, plugging into that information. And I'm just curious, what can we do better to educate parents about the realities of these inequities?
Yeah, it is hard, right? Because Boston is so segregated, and I'm not from here. I live in the North End, and like I said, like my little bubble that I live in, everybody knows about the exam schools, right? And so I just took it as a given. But I know that's not other people's reality. We had, they were talking about these forums that the NWEA and LCR had in the neighborhoods. And we had one, I think the summer before last in the North End, and a lot of packed, right? A lot of people came, but there was a group of families from East Boston and sat through the whole presentation. Everybody was there. And after an hour of hearing about it through a translator, a woman got up and said, so I have a child in the 6th grade, or going into 7th grade, it might have even been. How do I do this? Is it too late? She had never heard of it, right? So she's right. I can see him from, I can see East Boston from my office. And if I go down to my park, and then we went a week or two later, had another meeting. 30 people showed up, 30 parents in the middle of August, sweltering hot day, 3:00 in the afternoon, coming to an education event about their kids, right? They care deeply about their children and their children's education. And so somebody from LCR gave the pitch, and about 15 minutes in, somebody said, who has heard of the exam schools? Nobody raised their hand, but a woman in that meeting pulled out of her purse a piece of paper folded in quarters, right? And when she unopened it, you could see the light through the lines, like she had it in her purse a while. She knew it was so important. She knew it was something about her child, right? And it was a flyer about the exam schools. And I had been on the committee that said we should send flyers in Spanish, but it had no context, right? It said, come hear about the IC test. So you can send your kid to East Boston or to Boston Latin, which is, all the way across the harbor and whatever. nobody knew what it was, right? So even when we try to do engagement, we're not doing it in a way that's meaningful to the people that we're reaching out to. So we have to have more families in there. If we want to reach Latinx families, we have to have Latinx families at the table to design it. Because I, with my best intentions on that committee with lovely people, right, came up with this flyer that was meaningless, but this woman knew that it was important, right? She had it in her purse, but we still didn't reach her. So I think it's that we need more representation when we're designing these things for families, right? Somebody at the table.
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate that. You know, I often talk about the fact that my mom didn't even finish 4th grade. So, and I didn't even know exam schools existed. I think you already know this. But there is that level of disconnect. And I think that the district says that they're doing the best that they can to engage families. And then I often come across families who have never heard of anything that the district allegedly has put out. And so they're you know, I do believe that parents are oftentimes an afterthought on all decisions that are being made. And I think that if we've learned anything about this process, that we are going to have to center this through a very different, we're going to have to do this work differently, and it has to be led by parents and those who are living the realities, and that it should be from the bottom up instead of like, here's what we're proposing. Why don't you react to this? It should be like, here's what we're thinking. Here's how you know, how can you make it happen? Like, I feel like that is, especially if we're the taxpayers and these are our schools. I don't want to, I know we're here to talk about the exams, but the exam schools are part of the conversation. Counselor Asabi George, so I don't want to go out of on a whole other tangent. But
I do want to be mindful that we have a number of individuals signed up for public testimony.
So that's so thank you all for participating, and you have an ally in me, and I really do appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Do Christine or Katie, Lisa or Denise have anything else to add before we go to public testimony?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. Everyone has a different perspective, but everyone has passion on what they're presenting, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to come out and speak and share their truth. And I hope that we can continue to do this and bridge this work together.
Thank you very much, Denise. And I know Christine had something to say. And if you are here to offer public testimony, if you would raise your little blue hand will bring you over in just a few minutes. Christine.
Just a really quick pitch again for the transparency of the task force that goes ahead, sharing the research with the community, with parents, and a mindfulness that this process actually makes the district-wide high schools even more important, and 6th through 8th grade more important than ever. And it's going to be under a lot of watchful eyes. So just keeping that, just a pitch for that. Thank you.
Oh, great point.
One pitch for student voice on the task force too.
Yeah, excellent. I know that Kamari James brought that up last night a number of times throughout the evening and during closing remarks as well. Katie, anything before we switch over to public testimony?
I don't think so. No, I was in just in response to Councilor Arroyo's question earlier. I was going to share just that some people in our email group shared concern about the fact that you know, maybe it had to be designed this way, but that the public comment period last night just went on instead of being divided into a few nights. So it's just untenable for a lot of community members who wanted to participate. And then one person commented on, and I don't want to say which language it was because I'm not sure, maybe somebody else remembers, but that, you know, wasn't the most effective translation, so that what was being said in, I can't remember if it was Cantonese, was not the same as what was being said in English. And it was a lot of the quality of the comment was lost. So just a couple of other things in terms of
appreciate that. And happy to, if you'd like, the that communication to send over to any of our offices, or I'd suggest all of our offices, as well as to the Council's Committee on Education. So that's the ccc.education@boston.gov, but send it to us, to the council as a whole.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much for being with us and for, I think, sticking it out. I know Ricardo and I were tuned in late to school committee and appreciate that you all have stuck it out with us this evening. Thank you. You're welcome to stay or go during public testimony.
Thank you so much to all of you. And you as well, Madam Chair. I know it's been a long day.
Thank you. Councilor Roy will now go to public testimony. Carrie, who I know is or actually, I think I've got, I'm going to bring in for public testimony, Darun Lee, and I'm going to pronounce this probably incorrectly, but maybe Shusha Zhao. The two of you I'm going to bring up for public testimony. And anyone else that would like to offer public testimony, please raise your blue hand.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak today.
And thanks for your patience and waiting so long.
Totally. Yeah, I went to two of the information session of the working group, and the last night I waited basically 7 hours to speak. I really feel this connection between the working group and the rest of the family. And even today, this working group claim last night was a conversation. It's not a conversation at all. They already made a decision. They pushed to a vote without getting the input from the whole community. This is clearly trying to divide the community rather than unite the community. This is something I feel totally, and basically not honest. I don't want to say the bad word here, but that's honest. That's honesty. I feel they are not honest about the situation. And the second, trying to say, they are trying to make big change without fully evaluate the situation. Just for example, how to evaluate a student to give them opportunity to get into Latin or any of the exam school. It's a serious conversation between the students, between the family, between the society and the community. And it had to be evaluated many things. I think yesterday, one of the criteria from the working group seems like is smartness, or is how they are doing good in the school. But there are lots of other things. For example, the dedication, the hard work. Actually, yesterday, hard work was criticized by the working group. That's totally unfair, clearly unfair. And even today, again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and from beginning about the explanation of the exams and the sharing the experience with Chicago, the evaluation system. I think those things we need to do more rather than make a decision right away, and just then let the folks like me to, basically live with it, right? If I have opportunity, honest, I will leave Boston, but now I don't. Lots of people like me don't. And I think another thing, the working group or some of your previous colleague mentioned here is totally out of touch our life. First immigration like me, right? We don't have the roots here. We don't have the connection here. If we don't do well at school, our children, what they gonna do? How they can find a job? How they can find the opportunity, right? This is clearly a disconnection between the first, even second generation immigrants compared to people who live here long enough. And only school is one way to to help us to do our work and basically get a job, get paid here. To use another word to say is to fulfill American dream. And if we go back to a system based on I don't know whether that's a socialism or not, how that be fair? I think, again, back to some of the early comments, is this system currently the way is fair or not? How to fairly evaluate the student to give them a chance to get into Boston Latin, which are Boston exam schools, which are not just a public school. And as we discussed here, if you see one of the slides from the working group, actually it's quite shocking to me. African American, Latin American public school student at 4 years, at the 4th grade, left for so behind of other students and for so behind other schools just around the Boston. That's clearly testimony that current system does not work. If you can bring those students up, there will be more, automatically there will be more representation of African American and Latin American. And without working into that direction, just focus on changing currently how get into Latin. To me, that's clear. Latin or exam school in the future will just become another Boston public high school. Do you want to put your kids there? I don't know. One of the colleague here, Paris, one of the presenter here said, all those Boston public high school are great schools. To you, maybe. To me, no. Clearly, no. So those are this connection. I feel we don't have the conversation. We don't have the conversation between the parents, the student, with the school committee. But they already made a decision. They already voted. Now we have to basically to left us to a situation where different. Last point I have to say is.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead. This is your last point. Thank you.
Okay, last point. By zip code, this discrimination. I don't know whether your lawyer is still here. I don't know why by zip code this is not unlawful. This is totally discrimination. And even in the same zip code, clearly there are some people are low income, but they are penalized by living people with a rich neighborhood. That's totally unfair. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you for this the meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next we have Shua Zhao.
Yeah.
Please correct me.
Yeah, you're fine. Thank you. I'm kind of nervous. So I'll just read what I wrote. So I want to thank you, dear Madam Chair and dear councilors for allowing me to speak here this evening. So as I said, my name is Shua Zhao. I'm a proud Boston resident. I moved here three years ago because I heard Boston is a really smart city. I think the BPS exam schools are one of the very reasons why Boston won this wonderful reputation, and also these exam schools they provide qualified, hardworking students to the top-notch colleges in the world, and also the trainings and knowledge the students received from these schools actually enable them to challenge the unmet needs of our time, and also make this city, even this country, stay competitive, in this challenging time. And also their academic excellence, were achieved by generations and generations, of hardworking and also talented students and teachers. But in my opinion, recruiting students by zip codes, really puts this academic excellence, of the exam schools at risk. The thing about it, we are Olympic teams, recruit their team members by zip codes. We are Harvard actually recruit their students by zip codes. We know they wouldn't, because they must recruit their members, by high entrance standards in order to remain competitive. The exam schools are called exam schools because of the entrance exams. Exams are not ideal, but it's one of the best and objective ways to identify qualified individual students for these schools, and also to keep the schools remain competitive. As one of the counselor mentioned, PPS has plenty of high quality application-based schools, I think, we should make these schools, more competing by allocating more resources, to this application-based schools, but not by lowering the entrance standards of our top-notch exam schools. I work in science, in our scientific field, it's colorblind, because major scientific breakthroughs are benefiting human beings as a whole, not just the particular races that the scientists, belong to. Similarly, for our social leaders, when Martin Luther King Jr. said he had a dream, he offered a better future, not only for the race he belonged to, but also for all the kids of all colors. BPS should not be about race, but about academic excellence, about making qualified individuals to solve the unsolved problems that our generation is facing. I believe the forefathers established these exam schools for the purpose of academic excellence. They have achieved their goal, as the prestigious BPS exam schools have become icons of Boston and are attracting top students from all over the city. You have no idea how famous these exam schools are. I heard about them, long before I came to Boston. It must have been extremely difficult to make metropolitan public schools top schools in the country, but you did it. Boston did it. It's just like a miracle to many major cities. So, let's respect, the legacy of these, prestigious schools and keep their entrance exams. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony this evening. We next have Sino Biologic. If you'd like to offer your remarks. Sino? We have you here for testimony now. Please introduce yourself for the record. Thank you. Welcome. Would you like to give your testimony?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, I'm talking to you. I'd love you to give your testimony, please.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I just give you a brief introduction about myself. So based on my first name, last name, I come from China. So actually, I come from southwestern of China, Chongqing. I'm very pro countryside. And I have a big family. Both my mom and mother, both my mom and daddy are farmers. So I have 7 siblings. I'm 5 out of 7. So I grew up step by step from the very bad country village elementary school. Eventually, I went to the college, and gradually, after the exam, I come to Boston University, got my PhD in biochemistry. Then I went to Dana-Farber for postdoc. So I always tell my daughter, you have to work hard to earn the life you like. Nothing can be guaranteed. Nothing can be guaranteed. And during this hearing, I heard lots of people talk about equity. So equity based on what? Based on zip code? Based on race? Everybody born equal. But gradually, people become different, right? Then if we want to the better life, we have to pursue it. We have to work on it. So, and also the admission take the parents' information into account, and especially affect this a lot. For example, a parent income, the zip code. So the children want to go to the school. Why we are not admitted? The parents go to the school. So why we need to take account the parents' information into account, and Also, for example, I have a full-time job. I also have a part-time job. So I work hard, try to give a better condition and to help my daughter prepare herself better for the future. So what's wrong for the parents work hard to earn higher income and give the better opportunity or prepare their children better for the future? So nothing wrong. And so I would also agree that the admission based on the zip code definitely is a discrimination. Yeah, thank you. That's my point.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony this evening. I do want to make sure if there's anyone else in the waiting room that would like to offer testimony, this is the time to raise your blue hand. I see that Ms. Sullivan is coming back to us. Ms. Sullivan, did you have additional testimony to offer? Tanisha? Tanisha, I see that you've rejoined us. Did you have additional testimony to offer? All right, Councilor Ricardo, Councilor Mejia, I know that we've lost Councilor Wu. If either of you have additional remarks or closing remarks to offer, please do.
Just thank you. I know that you were up until 2 a.m. because I was up until 2 a.m. With yesterday's hearing. And I just want people to understand that I can be sort of cut and dry in the way I look at this because I look at it from the standpoint of racial equity before all things. And I know that examinations further racial inequity, they don't close those gaps. And so if we're talking about closing those gaps, it's important to me that we use tools that don't do that. But I also want to be clear that I hear families. And the one thing that I've taken from today and yesterday, because it was important to me to listen to all of that testimony, is that whether you are white, privileged, not privileged, a person of color in this city, there is a belief that these are the ways in which you secure the future you want for your children. And when we do it in that way, where it's me versus you versus them, we create this scarcity belief. And it's not to anybody's benefit. It harms all of us. Even if on the surface it does not seem like that because some of us benefit from the inequity, there's a harm being perpetuated even upon those children from the experiences and the realities of the world that they're not getting. And so I just want parents and students to know, anybody who listens to this,
I'm sorry.
You're good. Another hot mic moment there.
No, that was about hockey. The ring.
No. It was very tame, very tame.
I just got notice that the rinks, I think, have been closed. Maybe I'm breaking news here on our meeting. Sorry about that.
That is actually broken news. I didn't know that. But in terms of just all of you have spoken out about not feeling heard, feeling more like decisions have been made before you are even involved in the process. And this is not new. These are things that have existed for a long time. And I think we do have to move beyond having conversations about why that happens and move into a stage where we no longer are having conversations about parents feeling like things are being forced upon them without their partnership, without their ability to speak before a decision is made in earnest. And I think we really do have to get to that because it doesn't benefit, for instance, it doesn't benefit my side of looking at things from a racial equity standpoint to say, we're going to do this without buy-in. And it doesn't benefit the other side to say, hey, that's a good point, or this is a good point, but this is where we're coming from, to not be heard. And so, moving forward, I want folks to understand that I've taken to heart the fact that both sides on all of these issues consistently bring up that they're not heard, they're not involved in this process, and looking at ways to make sure that we do that better. So thank you to everybody who came on the panel today to talk about this, but also thank you to the parents and the students and the teachers and all of the folks who have come out to basically say too often it feels like decisions are made for them without them. And I think that does have to end. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia.
Yes, thank you, Councilor Sabi George. Like literally, you've been up for 48 hours. What a marathon. And thank you for your leadership and for hosting this and for, bringing people together to have difficult conversations, whether we want to have them or not, right? And I also would have to echo Ricardo Councilor Arroyo's sentiments as well, is that, you know, I represent 22 neighborhoods. And I understand that I am just a citywide councilor and I serve many constituencies. And I will always say that we may not always agree on political things, but you can always count on me to be 100% in terms of where I stand and why I'm taking the stands that I'm taking. And that is not to minimize what we've heard here tonight from some of the families who have felt unheard. I also think that Boston is very uniquely positioned in this moment in time to really bring ourselves across our differences together for the greater good of all, right? And I think that this conversation, as it relates to the exam school, is literally pitting Asian parents against Black and Brown parents and white parents versus Black and Brown parents. And I feel like that is the wrong conversation. When in reality, if we as parents recognize that the system in its entirety needs to be revamped, and that it's working for all of our students, then we wouldn't be having this push and pull. And so I just want everyone who tuned in tonight to know that you are heard. And at the end of the day, for me, it really is about making this as fair as possible for all students, because not everyone has the same access to resources and opportunities to excel in the exam space. And I understand that there needs to be something, but I just don't think that the exam route is the one thing that we should be focusing on as a way of determining whether who has access and who doesn't. And so I really do appreciate the opportunity to listen and to be here in community with you all. And thank you for being here with your true authentic selves. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you to Councilor Wu, who is not with us right now, and Councilor Arroyo for sponsoring this evening's hearing and for bringing together a number of panels. As was mentioned, it was important to me last evening to be up until the end. I want to say the bitter end, but until the end to hear the testimony, because something, regardless of where you are on this issue around the exam school process, and I don't want to use the term sides, because I don't think that there are sides. I think there's a spectrum of concern, a spectrum of interest, and a spectrum of willingness to be a part of the conversation, to make decisions about how our schools are operated, how students gain admission, how we determine invitation, especially to our exam schools. But as has been mentioned a number of times, we do have application schools in the city of Boston. We have district comprehensive high schools. We have smaller specialized high schools in the city of Boston. We have middle schools and elementary schools and early education programs that need our very intensive attention, and we need to do it in a very urgent way, especially right now and during this time, and using this time to make sure that we are focusing our energies on the services that are provided, both academic as well as the social and emotional services, and sort of all the other components that go into this, effort to educate our children across the city of Boston. It's really important that we do it with very specific intention, but that we're also doing it with a growth mindset and the certain ability to include voices at the table to inform those decisions. And we saw that, and again, part of why I wanted to listen to the 170 plus members of our city who offered public testimony last night, and to understand their opinions and their concerns and their thoughts about this work. So we will close this hearing, and there'll be additional questions for the administration, no doubt, and I imagine there will be a time in the near future where we will rejoin this conversation and continue it, and hopefully continue to do more work to support our students across the district. And I do want to note that today, I think, was a difficult day across our city as we again went fully remote for all of our students. And I want to pay particular attention to our students who are receiving special education services across the district, our students who are high needs and really have come to support, need the support of their school communities, their teachers and service providers across the district. And also want to make particular note to say that I'm thinking of our families who have our youngest children who should have come into our schools this week, and things have changed. So it's certainly a dynamic situation. I hope that everyone at home continues to be safe and be well. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Juan. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.